My mother texted me hours before my sister's engagement dinner to say I was uninvited. She claimed my cheap clothes and beat-up car would embarrass the family in front of her future in-laws, a family of so-called Manhattan elite. She told me the head count was final. So I stayed in my apartment and poured a glass of wine. I did not argue or beg. But when my sister called me later that night in absolute hysterics, demanding to know how I could destroy her perfect evening, she learned a very hard lesson. She had no idea that I was not just missing from the guest list. I was the one who owned the building. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who underestimated your worth. My name is Jocelyn. I am 34 years old, and I have spent the last decade building an empire completely hidden from the people who share my last name. I stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror in my Manhattan penthouse, smoothing the sleek lines of a custom black silk dress. Tonight was supposed to be my younger sister Sydney's engagement dinner. She was marrying Preston Kensington, the heir to a prominent financial firm, and my mother Beatrice had spent the last 6 months treating this upcoming wedding like a royal coronation. The dinner was taking place at the Obsidian Room, an ultra-luxury private dining club that boasted a 5-year waiting list just for a basic membership review. I reached for my diamond earrings when my phone buzzed on the marble vanity. It was a message from my mother. I opened it expecting a frantic reminder about being on time, or a critique of whatever she assumed I would be wearing. Instead, the harsh glow of the screen delivered a very different message. Jocelyn, do not come tonight. The head count is final. Preston's family is old money, and driving up in your used sedan wearing off-the-rack clothes will completely humiliate Sydney. We need this space for people who actually belong in their world. I will just tell them you had a shift at the kitchen and could not get away. A younger version of myself might have cried. A younger version of myself might have called her begging to be included, promising I would park several blocks away and keep my mouth shut the entire night. But at 34, I just felt a cold, sharp sense of absolute clarity. My mother had not changed at all. She still viewed me as the rebellious, foolish disappointment who threw away a comfortable, socially acceptable life just to work in restaurants. She had absolutely no idea that the kitchen I was supposedly working in was actually part of a multi-million-dollar hospitality empire that I had built entirely from the ground up. I typed a quick, emotionless reply, "No worries, enjoy the meal." I tossed the phone onto my bed, reached back and unzipped my dress. I let the expensive silk pool at my feet changed into a comfortable cashmere sweater and sweatpants, and poured myself a generous glass of vintage red wine. I settled into my sofa, looking out at the glittering New York skyline, feeling nothing but profound peace. 30 minutes later, my phone rang again. This time, it was Kendra, my brother Dominic's wife. Kendra is a brilliant African-American corporate attorney, and the only person in my family who has ever truly seen me for who I am. She is also fiercely protective, largely because she knows exactly what it is like to be on the receiving end of my mother's subtle, suffocating, and incredibly arrogant judgment. I answered the call and immediately heard the faint echo of a tiled bathroom in the background. "Jocelyn, are you seriously not coming tonight?" Kendra whispered furiously. Her voice bounced off the marble walls of the Obsidian Room's lavish restrooms. I took a slow sip of my wine. Beatrice uninvited me. She said the head count was final and my presence would embarrass the mighty Kensingtons. I heard Kendra let out a sharp, angry breath. That woman is unbelievable. I swear I'm going to walk out there and throw my champagne right in her face. Do you know what she just told Charles Kensington? She actually called you a cautionary tale. She sat there sipping her drink and told them you threw your life away scrubbing pots and pans because you were too stubborn to marry well like Sydney. I leaned my head back against the sofa cushions. "Let me guess," I said. "She brought up the time I refused to marry her business partner's creepy nephew 10 years ago. "Bingo," Kendra replied. "She is out there acting like Sydney is the absolute crown jewel of the family for landing a guy whose trust fund pays for his golf habits. Dominic is just sitting there staring at his plate, letting his mother run her mouth without defending you at all. I am losing my mind, Jocelyn. I cannot sit at this table and listen to them belittle you. You are worth 10 of Preston Kensington." I smiled, feeling a genuine wave of gratitude for my sister-in-law. Kendra, breathe, I told her softly. Do not ruin your evening. You have worked a grueling week at the firm, and you deserve a good meal. Let them eat. Let them brag. The night is young. Kendra sighed heavily, her frustration palpable even through the phone. You are entirely too calm about this. If my mother told me I was not fit to sit at a dinner table because of my clothes, I would burn the table down. I swirled the dark red wine in my glass, watching the way it coated the crystal. Who says I am not going to burn the table down, I murmured. Just enjoy the appetizers, Kendra. I will talk to you later. I ended the call and set the phone down, feeling the familiar thrilling hum of adrenaline that always preceded a major business move. My family thought I was a struggling kitchen worker. They thought I was sitting in a cramped, drafty apartment crying over my exclusion from their high society gathering. They did not know that Aura Holdings, the parent company of the Obsidian Room, belonged entirely to me. And they certainly did not know that Kendra, the daughter-in-law, my mother constantly underestimated and threw microaggressions at, was actually the chief legal officer of my entire corporate empire. As I took another sip of wine, my phone illuminated with an incoming call. It was my general manager at the Obsidian Room. I answered on the first ring. Good evening, Mr. Hayes. Is everything running smoothly tonight? He cleared his throat politely. Good evening, ma'am. The service is flawless, but I have a situation with VIP Room 1, the Kensington and Hayes party. I smiled into the empty room. What seems to be the problem? Well, ma'am, he continued, the mother of the bride has been incredibly demanding and rather rude to our sommelier. Furthermore, they are ordering our most exclusive vintage bottles. The total bill is climbing rapidly. Knowing they are your relatives, I wanted to ask how you would like me to handle the final check. Usually we comp the meals for your family. I stood up and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, pressing my hand against the cool glass. The head count is final, Mr. Hayes, I said softly. Treat them exactly like any other guest. In fact, do not offer them the house discount. Charge them full price for every single drop. And Mr. Hayes. Yes, ma'am. When it is time to present the bill, make sure you hand it directly to my mother. I convinced Kendra to leave the call connected before she walked out of the restroom. She smoothly slipped her phone into the breast pocket of her tailored blazer, ensuring the microphone was perfectly positioned to capture every word spoken at VIP Room 1. I sat back on my velvet sofa, placed my AirPods in my ears, and took a slow sip of my wine. The audio feed was crystal clear, capturing the faint clinking of crystal glasses, the soft jazz playing in the background, and the unmistakable, sickeningly sweet tone of my mother's voice. Beatrice was aggressively flattering Charles Kensington, practically begging for his approval. Her voice dripped with the kind of desperate sycophancy she reserved strictly for people with higher net worths than her own. Charles Wick must say, Preston's latest acquisition strategy is simply brilliant. Sydney is so fortunate to be marrying into a family with such a profound legacy in Manhattan finance. We share the exact same values. Pedigree matters, and maintaining a pristine family image is everything to us. Charles chuckled arrogantly, clearly soaking up the praise like a sponge. Well, Beatrice, we certainly expect excellence. My son is poised to take over the firm next year, and he needs a wife who understands the rigorous social demands of our circle. Then came my sister Sydney's high-pitched, self-important voice. I understand completely, Charles. That is exactly why I insisted we host the engagement dinner here tonight. The Obsidian Room is completely impossible to book. The waiting list for a basic membership review is 5 years. But the owner is notoriously private, a total phantom. Luckily, we run in the same circles. I reached out through a mutual friend, and she absolutely begged me to host my engagement here. She knows the immense value of having the Kensingtons and our family associated with her brand. I actually laughed out loud in my empty penthouse. Sydney had never met me in a professional capacity, let alone spoken to the elusive owner of the Obsidian Room. She was spinning a massive web of lies to impress her future father-in-law, blissfully unaware that the phantom owner she was bragging about was the very sister she had just banned from the building for wearing cheap clothes. Is that so? Sydney Charles's booming voice cut through the ambient restaurant noise. He sounded amused, but there was a sharp, dangerous edge to his tone. Your connections must be truly remarkable. Because as it turns out, the phantom owner is not quite so invisible anymore. I heard the distinct heavy slap of a glossy magazine hitting the solid oak dining table. I picked up the weekend edition of the Wall Street Journal on my way over here from my club. Charles continued, his tone dripping with condescension. The luxury magazine insert dropped this afternoon. It seems the financial world finally tracked down the elusive founder of Aura Holdings. I heard the rustle of thick paper pages turning. The cover story is quite the read, Charles announced, reading the text aloud for the entire table. The Invisible Empress. Unveiling Jocelyn, the 34-year-old founder of Aura Holdings and the Obsidian Room. A self-made billionaire, reshaping Manhattan real estate and luxury hospitality. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that entirely sucks the oxygen out of a room. Then came the sharp, unmistakable clatter of heavy silver hitting fine bone china. Beatrice had dropped her fork. Now Charles said, his voice tightening with sudden aggressive suspicion. Beatrice, correct me if I am wrong. Did you not tell me just an hour ago that your estranged older daughter Jocelyn was a massive cautionary tale? Did you not specifically say she threw her life away and was currently scrubbing pans in a commercial kitchen in Queens because she was too stubborn to marry well? I heard my mother stammer. The usually silver-tongued social climber could barely form a single coherent sentence. Well, Charles, there must be a mix-up. It is a common name. Jocelyn has always been prone to exaggerating her employment to make herself sound important. That was when Kendra chimed in. Her voice was cool, professional, and dripping with absolute satisfaction. It is not a mix-up, Beatrice. Look at the full-page portrait on page 12. More rustling of paper echoed through my AirPods. Then Sydney let out a sharp, genuine gasp of horror. That is her, Sydney whispered, her voice trembling with panic. That is Jocelyn. She is wearing a bespoke tailored suit, standing on the rooftop of this exact building. Charles slammed his hand on the table, causing the glassware to rattle violently. You lied to us. You sat there and told my family your daughter was a destitute embarrassment because you were ashamed of her. But she owns the very building we are sitting in. Do you have any idea how much capital Aura Holdings controls? Preston's firm has been trying to secure a meeting with Aura's acquisition board for 6 straight months. We desperately need their capital to back our new fund. Dominic spoke up next, his voice filled with total bewilderment. Wait, Mom, you sent Jocelyn a text telling her not to come tonight because her car and her clothes would embarrass us. You locked a billionaire out of her own restaurant. Total chaos erupted at the table. Beatrice began hyperventilating, her desperate apologies overlapping with Charles's rising anger. Sydney was crying, whining loudly about how her perfect engagement dinner was ruined, and how incredibly unfair it was that I had hidden my wealth from my own flesh and blood. They were completely unraveling, turning on each other the exact moment their fabricated reality shattered against hard financial facts. I had heard enough. I tapped my AirPod, ending the call, and took another slow sip of my wine, savoring the complex, bold flavor of the vintage. My family had spent my entire adult life treating me like a worthless outcast, and it took exactly one magazine article to bring them to their knees. The satisfying silence in my apartment did not last long. My phone lit up on the coffee table, buzzing violently against the glass surface. The caller ID flashed brightly in the dim room. It was Sydney calling in an absolute panic. I let the phone ring 3 times before swiping to answer. I brought the device to my ear but did not say a word. I did not have to. Sydney's voice exploded through the speaker, shrill and frantic, completely devoid of her usual curated elegance. What kind of sick joke is this? Sydney shrieked. Her breathing was ragged. You own this place. You are the founder of Aura Holdings. Why did you not tell us? Preston's dad is sitting right here, and he wants to pitch a buyout to your board. Get down here right now, Jocelyn. You are embarrassing me. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my wine. The sheer audacity of my sister was almost impressive. Less than 3 hours ago, she and my mother had deemed me socially unfit to breathe the same air as the Kensington family. Now that they realized I held the keys to the kingdom, my absence was suddenly an embarrassment. I am afraid I cannot do that, Sydney, I replied, my voice perfectly level. I thought the headcount was final. Besides, my off-the-rack clothes would completely ruin the aesthetic of your flawless evening. Stop being petty, Sydney snapped. I could hear the desperate tremor in her voice. This is about my future. Charles says your company has the capital Preston's firm desperately needs. You have to come down here and take this meeting. Do you have any idea how much money is on the line? I know exactly how much money is on the line, I said calmly. I also know that you have been snapping your fingers at my waitstaff all night. You sent back a perfectly seared Wagyu steak because you claimed the chef lacked refinement, and my mother threatened to have a server fired over a water glass. They are the help, Sydney argued, completely missing the point. They are my employees, I corrected her, my tone dropping to a dangerous chill. And the Obsidian Room has a strict code of conduct. We do not tolerate abuse of our staff, regardless of who the guest claims to be. Because of your table's behavior, I have instructed my general manager to revoke your temporary pass immediately. You cannot do that. We are in the middle of dessert. Watch me, I said, and ended the call. I placed the phone back on the coffee table and immediately unmuted the connection to Kendra's phone, which was still broadcasting live from the breast pocket of her blazer in VIP Room 1. I wanted to hear every single second of the fallout. Through the audio feed I heard, Sydney let out a strangled sob. She hung up on me. Sydney whimpered to the table. She is not coming down. Before Beatrice could formulate another lie to placate Charles Kensington, the heavy oak doors of the VIP room swung open. The rhythmic, confident footsteps of my general manager, Mr. Hayes, echoed clearly through the audio feed. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," Mr. Hayes announced. His voice was the picture of absolute, unshakable professionalism. "I hope the white truffle risotto and the 3 bottles of vintage Chateau Margaux met your expectations tonight. They were adequate." Beatrice sniffed clearly, trying to regain her footing in front of Charles. "Though the service has been rather slow, we will be expecting the house to comp this meal given my daughter's relationship with the owner." A brief, heavy silence fell over the room. I could picture Mr. Hayes standing there perfectly upright, holding a sleek black leather billfold on a silver tray. "I am afraid there has been a misunderstanding, ma'am," Mr. Hayes said smoothly. "Miss Jocelyn explicitly requested that no house discounts be applied to your table. In fact, due to multiple violations of our guest conduct policy regarding your treatment of our staff, she has officially revoked your temporary access pass." I heard Dominic gasp. Charles Kensington let out a low, dangerous scoff. "Here is your final check." Mr. Hayes continued, the sound of the leather folder hitting the table registering sharply through the microphone. "The total for this evening is $32,450. Miss Jocelyn requested you settle this immediately before our security team escorts you out of the building." The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. Beatrice let out a sound that was half gasp, half shriek. $32,000 for one dinner. We are family. She cannot possibly expect me to pay this. "I assure you, ma'am, the expectation is absolute," Mr. Hayes replied without missing a beat. "We accept all major credit cards. I will wait." The humiliation radiating from the table was palpable. Beatrice had insisted on hosting this dinner to prove to the Kensingtons that she belonged in their elite circle. She had ordered the most expensive items on the menu, fully intending to exploit my supposed connections to avoid paying for it. Now she was trapped. "Beatrice," Charles Kensington said, his voice dripping with absolute disgust, "are you telling me you cannot cover the cost of a dinner you invited us to, after bragging all evening about your immense wealth and connections?" "No, no, of course I can cover it," Beatrice stammered, her voice shaking violently. I heard the frantic rustling of a purse, the frantic zip of a wallet. "It is just the principle of the matter. My own daughter treating me this way." I listened as Beatrice slapped her credit card onto the billfold. A minute later, Mr. Hayes returned. "I apologize, ma'am," Mr. Hayes said, and I could hear the absolute dread settling over my mother. "This card has been declined." "Try it again," Beatrice hissed frantically. "There must be a mistake with your machine." "I have tried it twice, ma'am. The bank has blocked the transaction due to insufficient funds." The silence that followed was the sweetest sound I had heard in my entire life. My mother, the woman who had spent 34 years telling me I was a worthless embarrassment, was now publicly exposed as a fraud in front of the very billionaire she was trying to impress. Charles Kensington did not say a word. I heard the scrape of his chair pushing back from the table. Preston Charles commanded his son, "Get your coat. We are leaving. I will not sit here and be humiliated by a family of destitute con artists." "Charles, please," Beatrice begged, her voice cracking with pure desperation. "It is just a banking error. I can fix this. The heavy oak doors slammed shut as Charles and Preston walked out, leaving my mother, my sister Dominic, and Kendra sitting in the ruins of the engagement dinner. I will cover the bill. Kendra finally spoke up. I could picture her perfectly, her gorgeous locks pulled into a sharp corporate updo, radiating absolute power. Her calm, authoritative voice cut right through Beatrice's hysterical sobbing. But only because I refused to disrespect the staff who worked so hard tonight. You owe me $32,000, Beatrice. And I expect a wire transfer by Monday morning. I pulled my AirPods out and tossed them onto the sofa, letting out a long, satisfied breath. The first strike had landed flawlessly. I walked into my kitchen to pour another glass of wine, savoring the absolute quiet of my penthouse. But I knew my mother. I knew she would never accept defeat this easily. Her pride had been wounded, and a wounded narcissist always goes on the offensive. Right on cue, my phone lit up on the kitchen island. A text message from Beatrice flashed across the screen. I picked it up and read the furious, frantic words. "We are coming to your apartment right now. You are going to fix this." I stared at the threatening text message from my mother, the harsh white light of the screen illuminating the dark living room. She was coming to my apartment demanding that I fix the mess she had created. I did not feel an ounce of fear. I felt a deep, profound anticipation. For years, my family believed I lived in some dilapidated building on the edges of the city. I had never given them my actual unit number, only the street address of a high-rise in Tribeca, assuming they would never bother to visit the daughter they considered a massive disappointment. Today, their ignorance was going to be their greatest shock. I picked up my phone and dialed the front desk. Mr. Thorne, the night concierge, answered immediately. "Good evening, Miss Jocelyn," he said warmly. "Mr. Thorne, I am expecting 3 guests shortly. A woman in her early 60s, a younger woman, and a man in his 30s. They will likely arrive in a state of high agitation. Please do not stop them. Scan them straight through to my private elevator, but have 2 members of my personal security team escort them up." "Understood perfectly, ma'am," he replied. I ended the call and walked over to my kitchen island. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water, setting my wine aside. I wanted a perfectly clear head for what was about to happen. I adjusted the ambient lighting in the penthouse, letting the panoramic view of the glittering Manhattan skyline serve as the ultimate backdrop. Less than 20 minutes later, a soft chime echoed through the foyer. The polished steel doors of my private elevator slid open. Beatrice marched out first, her face flushed with absolute rage, ready to scream. Sydney was right behind her, clutching her designer handbag like a weapon. Dominic trailed at the back, looking stressed and exhausted. 2 burly security guards in dark suits stood behind them, ensuring they did not step out of line. But the moment their designer shoes hit the imported Italian marble of my foyer, the anger instantly drained from their faces. They stopped dead in their tracks. Their eyes widened, taking in the vaulted ceilings, the massive modern art pieces hanging on the walls, and the sweeping, unobstructed views of the city that only money could buy. They had stormed in here expecting a cramped, miserable studio apartment. Instead, they were standing in a $40 million fortress in the sky. I leaned against the kitchen counter, crossing my arms. "Welcome to my home," I said, my voice echoing slightly in the vast space. "Please do not bother taking off your shoes. You will not be staying long." Beatrice recovered first. The speed at which she completely abandoned her fury and switched to a sickeningly sweet maternal facade was terrifying. The venom vanished, replaced by a wide, desperate smile. "Oh, darling," Beatrice gasped, rushing forward with her arms outstretched as if she were going to embrace me. "Jocelyn, this place is incredible. Why on earth did you hide this wealth from us?" I held up a single hand, stopping her dead in her tracks. "Do not touch me, Beatrice." She froze, her hands hovering awkwardly in the air before she lowered them. She let out a nervous, high-pitched laugh. "Darling, you misunderstand everything that happened tonight. I told you to stay home because I wanted to protect you from the Kensingtons. They can be incredibly judgmental people. I had no idea you were a billionaire. If you had just told me, I would have proudly introduced you to Charles. Quick, go put on a nice dress. Charles wants a meeting right now. We can still salvage this evening." I stared at her, letting a cold, humorless laugh escape my lips. "You wanted to protect me." "Yes, exactly," she insisted, nodding her head vigorously. I am your mother. I have always wanted to protect you. I pushed off the counter and took a slow, deliberate step toward her. Protect me. You mean exactly like how you protected me when I was 22 years old. Like how you secretly drained my entire college savings account just to pay for Sydney's luxury backpacking trip across Europe. You looked me dead in the eye back then and told me I was not smart enough for a degree anyway, and that Sydney desperately needed the cultural exposure to find a suitable husband. Is that the kind of protection you mean tonight? Dominic shifted uncomfortably by the elevator doors. He had known about the stolen college funds back then, but like always, he had kept his mouth shut to keep the peace. Beatrice's face flushed a deep, ugly red. That was different. We were financially tight, and Sydney needed that trip for her social development. You were always so stubborn about working anyway. But that is in the past. We need to focus on tonight. Charles Kensington is furious, but he is willing to forgive the restaurant incident if you agree to a business partnership. Sydney pushed past our mother, her face streaked with ruined mascara. She pointed a manicured finger at me. Forget the ancient history, Jocelyn. You completely ruined my engagement dinner. Preston's father walked out because of you. Do you have any idea how much damage you just caused my relationship? You need to call Charles right now. You have to offer to invest in their firm. You clearly have the money. Save my wedding. I looked at my younger sister. For her entire life, she had been handed everything on a silver platter. She was entirely driven by status, completely blind to the reality of the world around her, and completely dependent on other people to clean up her messes. I turned my back on her and walked over to my desk near the window. I picked up a thick, black, leather-bound dossier that Kendra had meticulously prepared for me earlier that week. I walked back to the marble kitchen island and dropped the heavy folder onto the surface with a loud, resounding thud. I looked Sydney dead in the eye. Invest in what, Sydney? I asked, keeping my voice dangerously quiet. A bankrupt shell company. I flipped open the thick leather cover of the dossier. The crisp white pages inside detailed every hidden financial record, offshore shell account, and defaulted loan belonging to the esteemed Kensington family. I slid a heavily redacted bank summary across the smooth marble island toward my sister. Sydney stared at it, her perfectly manicured hands trembling slightly, though her eyes still stubbornly refused to accept the reality sitting right in front of her. Kensington Financial is functionally insolvent, I stated, my voice echoing coldly in the vast kitchen. They are currently carrying $120 million in toxic debt. Their commercial real estate investments completely tanked last quarter. Charles and Preston are not bringing you into a dynasty, Sydney. They are drowning, and they are desperately looking for a life raft. Sydney shook her head violently, her diamond earrings catching the ambient light. You are lying. You are just jealous because Preston comes from a better background than you ever could. He loves me. We are looking at chalets in the Swiss Alps for our honeymoon. They cannot even afford the catering bill for your reception, I corrected her sharply. Preston does not love you. He loves the illusion of wealth our mother projects. Charles Kensington targeted this family because Beatrice spends every waking second acting like she has bottomless pockets. They assumed marrying you would secure them a massive immediate injection of capital from your supposedly wealthy parents to keep their creditors at bay for another 6 months. You are not a bride, Sydney. You are a bridge loan. The color entirely drained from Sydney's face. She turned slowly toward our mother, seeking the usual comfort and validation Beatrice always provided. But Beatrice was not looking at Sydney. Beatrice was staring at the financial documents on my island, her breathing shallow and erratic. That is impossible, Beatrice whispered, her voice barely audible at first. She gripped the edge of the marble counter, her knuckles turning stark white. No. No, Charles showed me the prospectus for their new tech fund. It was guaranteed to triple in value by next spring. I tilted my head, watching my mother's carefully constructed reality shatter into a million pieces. A prospectus is just a piece of paper, Beatrice. Did you actually give them money? Beatrice let out a sudden piercing shriek that made Dominic flinch. That is impossible. We just wired Charles $2 million for Preston's new investment fund yesterday morning. It was supposed to be Sydney's dowry. It was going to secure her position in the family. The silence that followed was absolute and deafening. Even Sydney stopped crying, her mouth falling open in shock. But it was Dominic whose reaction shifted the entire energy of the room. Dominic stepped forward, his exhaustion entirely replaced by a rigid, terrifying stillness. He looked at our mother as if he were staring at a stranger. "Mom," Dominic said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "Where did you get $2 million?" Beatrice began to hyperventilate. Her eyes darted around my penthouse like a trapped animal looking for an exit. "It was an investment, Dominic. Charles promised me a 30% return. I was going to put the profits right back into the accounts before anyone noticed." "Where did you get the money?" Dominic roared, his sudden explosion of anger making both Beatrice and Sydney jump back. "We do not have $2 million in liquid cash. The brokerage is barely breaking even right now. Where did it come from?" Tears began streaming down Beatrice's face, destroying her expensive makeup. "I had to do it for your sister," she sobbed, clutching her chest. "Charles told me Preston could not marry into a family that did not have significant skin in the game. I took out a second mortgage on the house." Dominic stared at her, horrified. "The house is only worth $1 million. That leaves another $1 million. Beatrice crumpled, leaning heavily against the counter as her knees gave out. "I liquidated the family business assets. All the reserve accounts, the equipment holdings, everything. I cashed it all out and wired it to Charles." I watched my brother physically recoil. The family business was supposed to be Dominic's legacy. He had spent the last 15 years working 80-hour weeks, sacrificing his own holidays and weekends to keep our father's company afloat. He had poured his blood and sweat into that business, believing he was securing a future for himself and Kendra. And in a single morning, his own mother had secretly drained every last cent of his hard work just to buy a rich husband for her golden child. "You stole my future," Dominic whispered, his voice cracking with absolute devastation. "You stole my company, my life. You took everything I built, and you handed it to a con artist just so Sydney could have a fancy last name." "Dominic, please," Beatrice begged, reaching a hand out toward him. "It was a temporary transfer. Charles promised to pay it back after the wedding. We are family. You have to understand, Sydney needed this." Dominic looked at the woman who had birthed him with a level of disgust so profound it seemed to chill the air in the room. He slowly turned his head and looked at me. For my entire life, Dominic had been the passive peacekeeper, the brother who looked the other way when Beatrice tore me down, always too afraid to rock the boat. But standing in my kitchen, stripped of his inheritance and betrayed by the mother he had fiercely defended, the final illusion broke. He realized I had been right all along. They were parasites. Dominic took a step away from Beatrice and stood directly beside me, completely severing his loyalty to them. The shift in the room's dynamic was palpable. Dominic standing beside me was the ultimate fracture in Beatrice's carefully maintained illusion of control. For 34 years he had been the obedient son, the one who swallowed his pride to keep the peace. Now, looking at the mother who had just confessed to destroying his livelihood, his face was carved from stone. Beatrice reached a trembling hand toward him. "Dominic, please," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "Do not look at me like that. I am your mother. I did what I had to do for this family. You will get your business back. Charles is going to double our investment." The heavy mahogany door to my private home office clicked open. The sharp, rhythmic sound of designer heels against the Italian marble flooring echoed through the tense silence of the penthouse. Everyone turned to look. Kendra walked into the kitchen area. As an African-American woman who had fought tooth and nail to reach the absolute pinnacle of corporate law, she possessed a commanding presence that naturally demanded respect from everyone in a room. Everyone except my mother. Kendra carried a thick stack of watermarked legal documents in her hands. She stepped up to the kitchen island, standing right next to her husband. She placed a comforting hand on Dominic's rigid shoulder before turning her sharp, intelligent gaze onto Beatrice. Beatrice instantly bristled. Her panic momentarily gave way to her default state of elitist arrogance. She glared at Kendra, her lip curling in a familiar sneer. "This is a private family matter," Kendra, Beatrice snapped, waving her hand dismissively. "We are discussing high-level corporate finances. Why do you not go wait in the kitchen or find a television to watch? This conversation is far above your pay grade, and I will not have an outsider eavesdropping on our private estate planning." I slammed my hand down flat on the marble countertop. The loud crack made Sydney jump out of her skin. "Watch your tone, Beatrice," I warned, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. You are standing in my home and you will speak to my sister-in-law with the utmost respect. Kendra is not just Dominic's wife. She is not an outsider. She is the chief legal officer of Aura Holdings. Beatrice froze. Her mouth opened but no sound came out. Sydney stared at Kendra, her eyes darting between the thick legal files in Kendra's hands and the expensive custom-tailored suit she was wearing. For years, my mother and sister had treated Kendra with thinly veiled contempt, viewing her as a middle-class lawyer who was lucky to marry into their supposedly prestigious bloodline. They had no idea that the woman they constantly tried to belittle was the legal mastermind, defending a multi-billion-dollar real estate empire. Kendra did not even blink at Beatrice's shock. She coolly adjusted her glasses and slid the top document across the island. It was a copy of the second mortgage agreement Beatrice had signed with the bank just 48 hours ago. Since you are so well versed in high-level corporate finance, Beatrice, let us review your recent transactions. Kendra said, her tone clinical and perfectly steady. You took out a secondary mortgage on the primary family estate. You also fully liquidated the operational reserve accounts of Dominic's brokerage firm. You authorized a wire transfer of exactly $2 million to an offshore holding account registered to Charles Kensington. Beatrice swallowed hard, taking a step back. I had the right, she stammered defensively. I am the matriarch of the family business. Actually, you are not, Kendra corrected her swiftly. When Dominic's father passed away, the corporate structuring was updated. Dominic holds a legally binding 30% shareholder stake in the family brokerage. He is a primary signatory on all operational reserve accounts. Kendra picked up a second document, holding it up for Beatrice to see. The signature lines were highlighted in bright yellow ink. In order to liquidate those specific corporate assets you needed, Dominic's direct notarized signature on the authorization forms. Kendra explained, her voice cutting through the room like a scalpel. Dominic never signed these forms, Beatrice. Because he did not sign them, and you submitted them to the bank anyway, you have committed wire fraud. You committed corporate embezzlement. And by forging a secondary shareholder's approval to secure a multi-million-dollar loan, you have committed bank fraud. The color drained entirely from Beatrice's face. She looked like she was going to be sick. Sydney backed away from our mother, suddenly realizing the horrific legal jeopardy Beatrice had just pulled them all into. That is not true. Beatrice gasped, her hands shaking violently as she gripped the edge of the marble island. I did not forge anything. I just used a stamp of his signature. It was an executive decision. I was going to put the money back. It is not fraud if you put the money back. It is a federal offense, Beatrice, Kendra stated flatly, ignoring the pathetic excuse. You stole from your own son to buy a fake wedding for your daughter. And because Charles Kensington's firm is functionally insolvent, that $2 million is already gone. It was swallowed up by his creditors the second the wire cleared. He is never going to pay you back. You have defrauded a federal bank for money you can never recover. When the bank audits that loan and realizes the signature was unauthorized, you are looking at a minimum of 10 to 15 years in federal prison. Beatrice let out a strangled, terrified wail. Her legs finally gave out completely. She collapsed onto the polished marble floor of my penthouse, landing hard on her knees. The arrogant, status-obsessed woman, who had commanded every room she entered, was now reduced to a weeping, hyperventilating mess on the ground. Sydney covered her mouth with both hands, sobbing hysterically, as her dream of a high-society wedding dissolved into a criminal nightmare. Dominic looked down at his mother, his face completely devoid of any pity or compassion. He reached out, took Kendra's hand, and intertwined his fingers with hers, standing firmly united with the wife his mother had always disrespected. Beatrice looked up at me from the floor. Her mascara was running down her cheeks in dark, ugly streaks. She crawled forward on her knees, desperately reaching out to grab the hem of my cashmere sweater. "Jocelyn, please!" Beatrice sobbed, her voice breaking into a pathetic, high-pitched plea. "Please, you have to help me. You are a billionaire. $2 million is nothing to you. It is pocket change. You can wire the money to the bank right now. You can pay off the mortgage and replace the business reserves before they notice. Please, Jocelyn, I am your mother. You cannot let me go to prison. I will do anything." I looked down at the woman weeping at my feet. I felt absolutely nothing. No sadness, no guilt, no lingering sense of familial obligation. I reached down and calmly peeled her desperate, grasping fingers off my clothing. I took a slow step back, staring at her with cold, unwavering finality. I do not hand out charity to strangers. Monday morning arrived with the crisp and unforgiving clarity that only exists in Manhattan. I sat behind my desk in the executive suite of Aura Holdings. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered an unobstructed panoramic view of the city I had quietly conquered over the past decade. The chaos of Saturday night at my penthouse was entirely behind me. In this room, there was no family drama. There was only cold and calculated business strategy. Kendra sat directly across from me at the massive mahogany conference table. She wore a striking crimson suit, looking every bit the ruthless and brilliant corporate attorney she was. She was calmly reviewing the financial audits we had compiled over the weekend, detailing the absolute wreckage of Kensington Financial. The silence of the office was broken by the sharp ring of my private line. Only a handful of people possessed this specific number. I glanced down at the caller ID, and a slow smile spread across my face. It was Charles Kensington. I tapped the screen and put the call on speakerphone, ensuring Kendra could hear every single word. "Good morning, Charles," I said, my voice perfectly level and professional. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Charles did not bother with pleasantries. The polite and sophisticated facade he had worn at the engagement dinner was completely gone. He launched right into his intimidation tactic, sounding like a cornered animal trying to project dominance. "I am going to make this very simple for you," Jocelyn, Charles barked. His voice echoed through the pristine office, dripping with forced arrogance. "You are going to authorize Aura Holdings to buy the debt portfolio of Kensington Financial by the end of business today. You will inject the necessary capital to stabilize our stock, and you will do it quietly." I leaned back in my leather chair, crossing my arms. "And why on earth would I do that, Charles? You have absolutely nothing I want. Your firm is functionally insolvent." "Because family takes care of family, Jocelyn," he sneered. He said the word family like it was a weapon. "I know exactly what happened after I left your mother at the restaurant." Beatrice called me, sobbing hysterically. "She told me you refused to help her and threw her out of your apartment, knowing she is facing prison time." I made eye contact with Kendra. She raised an eyebrow, silently urging him to keep digging his own grave. "That sounds like a personal issue between Beatrice and the federal banking authorities," I replied smoothly. "It has nothing to do with my company." "It has everything to do with your company," Charles threatened. His tone grew louder and more aggressive. "Your entire brand is built on exclusivity, prestige, and class. What do you think will happen to the pristine reputation of the Obsidian Room when the media finds out its billionaire founder threw her own mother onto the street? I have contacts at every major financial publication in this city. If you do not buy our debt today, I will personally go to the press. I will make sure everyone knows you abandoned your mother and your sister to financial ruin. The scandal will tank your public image." I knew exactly what Charles was doing. He was a classic Wall Street bully. He was used to intimidating people into submission, and he mistakenly believed that because Beatrice was weak and easily manipulated, her daughter would be exactly the same. He had completely forgotten that he was speaking to a woman who built a billion-dollar empire from scratch. I decided to give him exactly what he wanted. I needed him to feel powerful. I needed him to drop his guard and hand me the final piece of the puzzle. I let a slight tremor enter my voice, expertly faking a tone of sudden hesitation and fear. "Charles, please," I said, softening my pitch. "A media scandal right now would trigger an immediate review by my board of directors. You cannot go to the press." I heard a sharp, cruel laugh on the other end of the line. He had taken the bait, hook, line, and sinker. "Then do the smart thing, little girl," Charles gloated. "Wire the funds to my firm. Save your family name and save your brand." I kept up the act of the frightened and out-of-her-depth daughter. "But Charles, even if I wanted to help, I do not understand how you operate. If I buy your debt, how do I know the funds will not just vanish like the money my mother gave you? You took $2 million from Beatrice and it disappeared instantly. I cannot risk my corporate capital if your accounts are being monitored by creditors. How did you even hide my mother's money so fast?" Charles scoffed. His ego was so massive he simply could not resist the opportunity to brag about his own supposed genius. He thought he was lecturing a naive girl who had just gotten lucky in the hospitality sector. You really do not understand high-level finance, do you? Charles mocked. Your mother's money did not just vanish. It was securely routed exactly where I needed it to go. My creditors cannot touch it because it never technically hit my domestic corporate accounts. I leaned forward slightly. Kendra picked up a digital recorder from the table and pressed a button, a small red light blinking to life. How is that possible? Charles, I asked, playing perfectly dumb. The bank records show she wired it directly to Kensington Financial. Charles let out a dismissive snort. That is just the intake shell. Within 60 seconds of that wire clearing, I initiated an automated transfer. I routed the entire $2 million through a series of offshore holding companies based in the Cayman Islands. It is sitting in a blind trust under a corporate proxy. The IRS does not know about it, and my domestic creditors cannot touch it. It was a brilliant maneuver. Your mother was foolish enough to think she was buying shares in a legitimate tech fund, but she actually provided my personal safety net. Now you are going to provide the corporate bailout. I looked at Kendra. She nodded, giving me a bright and absolutely predatory smile. We had everything we needed. I dropped the frightened girl act instantly. My voice turned to absolute ice, slicing through the speaker. Let me get this straight, Charles. You took unauthorized funds from a victim of bank fraud. You then actively laundered that money across international borders through offshore shell accounts, specifically to hide assets from federal tax authorities and domestic creditors. The line went completely silent. The sudden and drastic shift in my tone must have hit him like a physical blow. Wait, Charles stammered, his previous arrogance entirely evaporating. You should have done your research before you tried to blackmail me, Charles said coldly. I do not just own restaurants. I own the real estate, the holding companies, and the commercial spaces that house half the financial firms in this city. I know exactly how international wire fraud works. Jocelyn, listen to me, Charles started, panic finally bleeding into his voice. I ended the call, cutting him off mid-sentence. I set the phone face down on my desk and looked across the mahogany table. Kendra clicked the stop button on her digital recorder and set it down with a deeply satisfied sigh. Wire fraud, Kendra, said, her voice perfectly calm and legally precise. Money laundering, tax evasion, federal offenses, every single one of them. We have his complete verbal confession recorded with explicit details of the offshore routing. I stood up and smoothed the front of my blazer. Call the federal authorities, Kendra. Let them know we have a delivery for them. The Kensingtons are done. The Kensingtons and my mother marched into the towering glass lobby of Aura Holdings just before noon. They moved with the kind of unearned aggressive arrogance that only desperate people projecting false wealth can muster. The front desk security alerted me the moment they stepped through the revolving doors. They loudly demanded an immediate audience with the CEO, acting as though they owned the entire city block. I did not send anyone down to greet them. Instead, I instructed my security team to let them wait in the main lobby for exactly 45 minutes. Finally, I authorized my staff to escort them to the primary executive boardroom on the 70th floor. I watched their arrival through the discreet security cameras integrated into the boardroom ceiling. The high-definition video feed played directly onto the large monitor in my private office. Kendra and Dominic stood right behind me, watching the screen in absolute silence. Charles Kensington walked through the heavy oak doors and immediately marched to the head of the massive obsidian conference table. He sat down in the chairman's seat and adjusted his expensive tie, looking around the room with greedy satisfaction. He genuinely believed that my abrupt end to our phone call earlier that morning was a sign of total surrender. I thought I had hung up in sheer terror and was now frantically scrambling to prepare the corporate buyout documents to save my family name from a media scandal. Beatrice paced the length of the room, complaining loudly to the empty walls. I watched through the monitor as she criticized the temperature of the air conditioning and sneered at the sparkling water my staff had provided on silver trays. Sydney was completely ignoring the heavy tension in the room. She was busy pressing her face against the floor-to-ceiling windows, pointing excitedly at the adjacent skyscrapers. She turned to Preston and loudly declared that she wanted the corner office on this floor to use as her personal wedding planning headquarters. She claimed the natural light would be absolutely perfect for viewing floral arrangements and dress swatches. Preston just smirked, leaning back in a leather chair with his expensive shoes propped up carelessly on the polished stone table. It was time. I turned off the monitor and looked at Kendra, who held a single crisp folder against her crimson suit. I looked at Dominic, who took a deep breath, his jaw set with newfound unshakable resolve. We walked down the executive hallway together. The heavy double doors of the boardroom swung open. The sharp sound of our footsteps instantly silenced the room. I walked in first, keeping my posture perfectly straight. Kendra flanked my right side, radiating absolute corporate power, and Dominic flanked my left. I did not walk toward an empty chair. I did not sit down. I walked directly to the opposite end of the long table, standing tall and projecting unyielding authority over the room. Beatrice immediately started snapping, unable to control her inherent need to dominate. Jocelyn, it is completely unacceptable to make us wait for nearly an hour. We are family, and Charles has an incredibly busy schedule. You should be down on your knees thanking him for giving you the opportunity to invest in Kensington Financial instead of running to the press to ruin your reputation. I stared at my mother, letting her pathetic words hang in the cold air. I told you to watch your tone when you are in my building, Beatrice. I warned, my voice flat and dangerous. I do not apologize to guests who invite themselves into my corporate headquarters. Beatrice noticed Dominic standing beside me, and her face twisted in confusion. Dominic, get over here right now, she commanded, pointing at the floor next to her. Tell your sister to stop this ridiculous power trip and sit down. Dominic did not move a single muscle. He stared at the woman who had secretly liquidated his entire business just 2 days ago. He looked at her with pure, unfiltered disgust and crossed his arms over his chest. Beatrice visibly recoiled, her false confidence cracking slightly. Charles waved his hand, trying to play the benevolent dictator and regain control of the room. Let us skip the tiresome family drama, Charles ordered, his voice booming across the table. I do not have time for petty squabbles. We are here to finalize the debt transfer. I assume you have the contracts prepared, Jocelyn. My legal team will need to review the buyout terms before I sign over the Kensington portfolio to Aura Holdings. I expect the capital injection of $120 million to clear by the end of the business day. If it does not, my threat regarding the media still stands. I looked at Charles. I looked at his tailored suit, his arrogant posture, and the absolute staggering delusion in his eyes. He thought he had outsmarted me. He thought he had successfully cornered a scared, inexperienced little girl who would gladly hand over a fortune to protect a mother who hated her. I held out my right hand. Kendra stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the floor, and placed a single piece of paper onto my palm. I looked back at Charles, maintaining dead, unwavering eye contact. I placed my hand on the table and slid the single piece of paper down the length of the long, polished obsidian surface. It glided perfectly, stopping right in front of Charles Kensington's folded hands. Charles looked down at the paper, a smug smile still playing on his lips. But as his eyes scanned the bold black text at the top of the page, the smile vanished completely. The blood drained from his face, leaving him a sickly ashen gray. That is not an investment contract, Charles said, my voice dropping to a harsh, icy whisper that filled the dead silent room. That is a notice of intent to sue. Charles Kensington sat frozen in his oversized leather chair, his arrogant posture deflated like a punctured balloon. He stared at the bold black text on the notice of intent to sue, as if the words were written in a foreign language. The absolute silence in the boardroom stretched on, thick and suffocating. Preston leaned over his father's shoulder, his brow furrowing in confusion. He snatched the paper from the polished stone table. He read the header out loud, his voice cracking slightly. Notice of intent to sue. What is this? You cannot sue us, Jocelyn. We have not even signed a single contract with Aura Holdings yet. That is precisely the point, Preston, Kendra said. Her voice was smooth, melodic, and completely lethal. Kendra stepped forward and unclasped her leather briefcase. She pulled out 4 identical, neatly bound folders and slid one to each of the uninvited guests. Charles, Preston, Beatrice, and Sydney each received a copy of their own financial autopsy. I highly recommend you turn to page 4 of the audit provided, Kendra instructed. She paced slowly behind my chair, radiating absolute command of the room. As you will see, we did not just uncover the offshore accounts Charles bragged about on the phone this morning. We traced the exact trajectory of the $2 million Beatrice wired to you. You did not just hide that money from the federal government, Charles. You actively used it to commit securities fraud. Charles opened his mouth to speak but could not form a single syllable. Kendra continued her flawless dissection. You routed my mother-in-law's stolen funds to the Cayman Islands. But you could not just leave the money sitting there securely. Kensington Financial was facing a major liquidity crisis. Your domestic creditors were preparing to call in your loans. So you used a proxy corporation in the Bahamas to funnel that $2 million right back into the United States. You used the proxy to purchase massive blocks of your own company's worthless stock. Sydney looked at Preston, completely confused. What does that mean? Sydney asked, her voice trembling. It means they artificially inflated their stock prices, I answered, staring directly at my sister. They used our mother's stolen money to create fake market demand. It is a highly illegal tactic to trick federal regulators and investors into thinking their firm was profitable. They are running a massive Ponzi scheme, Sydney, and they used your engagement as the primary funding source. Beatrice slammed her hands against the obsidian table. She glared at Kendra with pure, unfiltered venom. "Shut your mouth right now," Beatrice screamed. Her face was contorted with absolute rage. "Who do you think you are? You are just Dominic's wife. You are nothing but an opportunistic woman who married into my family for our money. You have absolutely no right to speak to Charles Kensington this way. You do not belong in this room, you do not understand how real wealth operates, and your background is completely inadequate for this conversation." I struck the table with my open palm. The sharp, explosive sound echoed like a gunshot, making Beatrice flinch violently. "You will respect my chief legal officer," I demanded, my voice vibrating with dark, furious energy. I leaned forward, locking my eyes onto my mother. "You have spent the last 5 years treating Kendra like she was beneath you, making subtle, pathetic comments about her background, just because she did not come from your manufactured high society. But Kendra built her own success just like I did." I kept my gaze fixed on Beatrice, letting years of suppressed anger finally break the surface. "For years, you sat at every single Thanksgiving dinner and loudly proclaimed that I was the ultimate disappointment. You told everyone I was completely useless because I refused to play your shallow games and marry a wealthy man just to secure my social status. You praised Sydney as the golden child of the family. You paraded her around like a trophy because she finally found a rich heir who could elevate our family name." I pointed a finger at Preston, who was currently sweating profusely into his expensive collar. "But Sydney is marrying a total con artist," I said, driving every word home. "Preston does not have a dime to his name. His credit cards are maxed out. His trust fund was completely liquidated 3 years ago, and his luxury cars are currently flagged for repossession. You spent your entire life calling me a failure, Beatrice. Yet Sydney is marrying a criminal, and you funded his federal crimes by stealing the family business from Dominic." Beatrice looked like she had been physically struck. She turned to Charles, her eyes wide with desperate panic. "Charles, tell them this is a lie," Beatrice begged. "Tell them you have the money. Tell them you are going to pay me back so I do not lose my home." Charles did not look at her. He could not look at anyone. He was staring down at page 4 of Kendra's audit, realizing that his entire financial web had been meticulously unraveled by a woman his family had vastly underestimated. I saw the transaction numbers, the exact timestamps of the offshore wire transfers, and the corresponding stock purchases. The paper trail was absolutely undeniable. Preston was reading over his father's shoulder. His hands were shaking so badly, the thick paper rattled audibly in the quiet room. He read the final paragraph of the legal summary. Kendra had outlined the exact federal statutes they had violated, complete with the mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines for wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and illegal stock manipulation. Preston realized they were not just facing a civil lawsuit from Aura Holdings. They were facing decades in federal prison. The Securities and Exchange Commission would freeze all their remaining assets by the end of the day. The federal authorities would seize everything, and his privileged, comfortable life was officially over. The color completely drained from Preston's face. A heavy, terrified sweat broke out across his forehead. He swallowed hard, his breathing turning shallow and rapid. He looked at Sydney, who was sobbing softly into her hands, waiting for him to defend their future and their supposed love. Then he looked down at his father, the man who had orchestrated the entire fraudulent scheme. Preston dropped the audit onto the table. The instinct for self-preservation completely overrode his loyalty to his family and his fake bride. He was cornered, and he was preparing to save himself at any cost. Preston Kensington stared at the polished obsidian table. His chest heaved as he struggled to draw air into his lungs. The reality of a federal prison sentence had completely short-circuited his arrogant brain. He was a man who had spent his entire life coasting on his family name, using his father's wealth to shield himself from any real consequences. But there was no shield left. The audit Kendra had compiled was flawless. The federal government was going to seize his assets, his cars, his penthouse, and his freedom. He looked to his left, where his father Charles was sitting in stunned, humiliated silence. Then he looked to his right, where my sister Sydney was crying into her hands, completely oblivious to the fact that her fairy tale wedding had just legally tethered her to a massive criminal conspiracy. Preston made his choice. The instinct for self-preservation kicked in entirely, overriding any shred of loyalty he possessed. Preston abruptly pushed his heavy leather chair back from the table. The scraping sound echoed sharply in the silent boardroom. He took a wide step away from his father, physically distancing himself from the center of the fraud. "I did not know about the offshore accounts," Preston shouted. His voice was high and panicked, completely stripped of its usual smooth, polished charm. He pointed a shaking finger directly at Charles. "I am just the face of the domestic investment fund. My father handles all the international wire transfers. I had absolutely no idea he was laundering money through the Cayman Islands to inflate our stock prices. He kept me entirely in the dark." Charles snapped his head up, his eyes widening in pure disbelief. "Preston, shut your mouth right now," Charles barked, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. "You are a senior partner in this firm. I am not going down for your illegal accounting tricks." Preston fired back, his panic morphing into vicious desperation. He then turned his pointed finger across the room, aiming it squarely at my mother. "And I certainly did not orchestrate this fraudulent loan." Beatrice came to us. Sydney's mother offered the $2 million completely unprompted. She was absolutely desperate to buy her daughter a spot in our social circle. I thought it was a legitimate gift from a wealthy family. I had no idea this psychotic woman stole the money from her own son's business accounts just to buy a wedding. Beatrice let out a loud, strangled gasp, clutching her chest as if she had been physically shot. "You ungrateful parasite," Beatrice screamed, taking a step toward Preston. "I gave you that money to secure my daughter's future. You promised me a 30% return." "I promised you nothing." Preston spat back, his face twisting with absolute contempt. "You threw your stolen money at us because you are an insecure, status-obsessed fraud. You wanted to buy the Kensington name, and you were dumb enough to hand over millions of dollars without demanding a single legal contract. That is your own fault." Sydney stood frozen. The thick layer of denial she had been clinging to finally snapped in half. The handsome, wealthy prince she had been parading around Manhattan for the past year was standing right in front of her, loudly declaring that her family was nothing but a pathetic mark in a financial scam. All those months of bragging to her friends, all those times she rubbed her engagement in my face, it was all built on a massive, humiliating lie. "Preston," Sydney whispered, her voice trembling violently. She took a tentative step toward him, her hands reaching out as if she could somehow grab hold of the illusion and pull it back together. "What are you saying? You asked me to marry you. You said you loved me. You told me we were going to spend a month in Paris for our honeymoon. You picked out the venue." Preston turned to look at my sister. There was no love in his eyes. There was no affection, no warmth, and absolutely no remorse. He looked at Sydney with a level of cold, naked disgust that made even my own stomach turn. The charming, loving fiancé mask completely melted away, revealing the ruthless, bankrupt opportunist hiding underneath. Paris. Preston scoffed, letting out a harsh, mocking laugh that echoed terribly in the large room. "How exactly were we going to pay for Paris, Sydney? My credit cards have been declining for 6 months. I do not have a private jet. I do not have a yacht. I needed capital to keep my creditors from throwing me into bankruptcy court." Sydney shook her head, tears streaming freely down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. "But the ring," she sobbed, holding up her left hand to display the massive diamond on her finger. "You gave me this ring. It is a cubic zirconia," Set in cheap silver, Preston stated flatly, completely unbothered by her devastation. I bought it from a prop supplier in the garment district for $200. I needed you to believe I was wealthy, so your mother would keep writing checks. You were never going to be my wife. You were just a useful idiot with a desperate, easily manipulated mother. The silence that followed Preston's brutal confession was the heaviest thing I had ever felt. Sydney stared at the man she had been boasting about for a year. She looked at the fake ring on her finger. She looked at the mother who had stolen a fortune just to facilitate this humiliating sham. The realization that she was entirely worthless to him, that she had been used, played, and publicly discarded, hit her all at once. Something inside the golden child completely snapped. Sydney let out a blood-curdling, animalistic scream. She did not cry. She did not beg. She lunged. Sydney launched herself across the obsidian boardroom table with terrifying speed. She cleared the polished stone surface, knocking over crystal water glasses and scattering the meticulous legal audits Kendra had prepared. Preston barely had time to raise his hands before Sydney crashed into him. She slammed her fists into his face, tearing at his expensive tailored suit, screaming obscenities that echoed off the glass walls. Preston stumbled backward, losing his footing. He crashed into the heavy leather chairs, bringing Sydney down to the floor with him. He yelled in pain as her manicured nails raked across his cheek, drawing bright red blood. Charles shouted for someone to stop her. Beatrice stood paralyzed, screaming Sydney's name in absolute horror. Dominic grabbed Kendra by the waist and pulled her safely back against the wall, shielding her from the violent chaos erupting in the center of my boardroom. I did not move an inch. I stood at the head of the table and pressed the silent panic button mounted beneath the wood trim. Within seconds, the heavy oak doors burst open. 4 of my private security guards rushed into the room. It took 2 massive guards to pry Sydney off of Preston. She was kicking, thrashing, and sobbing hysterically, her perfect hair tangled and wild. Preston scrambled backward across the floor, clutching his bleeding face, his expensive suit ripped at the shoulder. The flawless high society couple that Beatrice had sacrificed her entire family to create had just destroyed each other right in the middle of my corporate headquarters, and the real consequences had not even begun. My private security guards dragged a thrashing Sydney to one side of the expansive boardroom and shoved Preston toward the other. Preston dabbed at his bleeding cheek with a torn silk handkerchief, whimpering pathetic threats about pressing assault charges. I signaled my men to hold them firmly in place. The physical violence was over, but the financial execution was just reaching its climax. Beatrice was still on the floor. Her grand illusion of joining Manhattan's elite had violently collapsed around her. She had no wealthy son-in-law to save her sinking ship. She had no $2 million. All she had was the looming, terrifying reality of a federal indictment for bank fraud. She scrambled to her feet, her designer dress wrinkled and stained with water that had spilled from the overturned crystal glasses on the table. She looked wildly around the room until her panicked eyes locked onto my brother. She rushed toward him, grabbing Dominic's arm with trembling, desperate hands. "Dominic, please," Beatrice pleaded. Her voice was thick with hysteria and deep delusion. "You have to talk to Kendra. You have to make your wife drop these audits and call off the lawsuit. If Aura Holdings does not report the forged signatures to the bank, the federal authorities will never know. We can fix this. I can sell the house. I can rebuild the brokerage. You have to protect your mother." Dominic looked down at her hands, gripping his tailored sleeve. He did not look angry. He looked entirely exhausted, like a man finally waking up from a 30-year nightmare. For his entire life, Dominic had played the role of the dutiful son. He had absorbed Beatrice's demands, managed her explosive temper, and quietly kept the family business running while she drained the profits to fund her lavish lifestyle. He reached over and carefully, methodically removed her fingers from his arm. He took a deliberate step back to stand shoulder to shoulder with Kendra. "No," Dominic said. His voice was incredibly calm, which made the absolute finality of his words cut even deeper. "I am not protecting you anymore. I am done." Beatrice gasped, clutching her chest as though she had been physically struck. "You cannot turn your back on me. I gave you that business. I gave you everything." "You took everything," Dominic corrected her. His voice rose slightly, the years of suppressed, suffocating rage finally breaking the surface. "You drained my entire college savings account when I was 18 years old, just to pay for Sydney's lavish Sweet 16 party and her designer wardrobe. You told me to take out high-interest student loans because family requires sacrifice. I worked 80-hour weeks to build that brokerage back up from the brink of bankruptcy after Dad died. I missed anniversaries with my wife to secure our clients. And the exact second you needed to buy Sydney a high-society husband, you forged my signature and stole my entire life's work. Beatrice shook her head frantically, tears ruining what was left of her makeup. I was going to pay you back. I did it for the family legacy. Sydney needed this marriage to elevate us. You did it for yourself. Dominic fired back, taking a step toward her. You wanted to sit at your elite country clubs and brag to your shallow friends. You treated Jocelyn like garbage for decades because she refused to be your social prop. You treated my wife with constant disrespect because she did not fit into your racist, elitist worldview. You never cared about any of us. You only cared about how we made you look. Sydney, still restrained by a security guard, sobbed loudly from the corner of the room. Dominic, how can you say that? We are a family. We have to stick together. Dominic did not even look at our sister. He kept his eyes locked on Beatrice, who was now weeping loudly, trying desperately to play the victim. Dominic, please, I am your mother. Beatrice cried out, her voice echoing off the glass walls. You are my son. We are family. Dominic looked at her with pure, unfiltered pity. I have no family left except Kendra and Jocelyn. You and Sydney are absolutely nothing to me. Beatrice let out a devastated wail, but the true punishment had not even begun. Dominic reached inside his suit jacket and pulled out a thick folded legal document. He placed it flat on the obsidian table, right next to the ruined financial audits Kendra had presented earlier. He pulled a silver pen from his pocket and uncapped it. Beatrice stared at the paper, her eyes widening in fresh terror. What are you doing? She whispered. What is that? Dominic looked at me across the table, giving me a firm, resolute nod. This is a transfer of ownership, Dominic declared, his voice ringing with absolute authority. I am officially signing over my remaining 30% shareholder stake in the family brokerage directly to Aura Holdings. Sydney gasped. Preston, still bleeding in the corner, looked up in sudden realization of what this legal maneuver actually meant. Kendra stepped forward, tapping the crisp white paper with a perfectly manicured finger. She delivered the final blow with surgical precision. By transferring his shares to Jocelyn's corporate entity, Aura Holdings now possesses the controlling interest required to freeze your corporate accounts, Kendra explained smoothly. Because you committed fraud to secure a loan against those assets. This transfer gives Jocelyn the absolute legal right to immediately liquidate all remaining properties, capital, and holdings of your business to recover the stolen funds. Beatrice stumbled backward, bumping into a heavy leather chair. You have no company left, Beatrice, Kendra stated coldly. We are taking the building, the client lists, and the operational reserves. You have absolutely nothing. Dominic clicked his pen and signed his name on the bottom line with a swift, aggressive stroke. He did not hesitate for a single second. He slid the paper across the smooth stone table over to Kendra, effectively handing over the keys to Beatrice's entire financial existence. The family business was gone, absorbed into my empire with the stroke of a pen. Beatrice realized she was completely trapped. She had no money, no business, and the federal authorities were moments away from uncovering her bank fraud. She had alienated her son, sold out her daughter to a con artist, and deeply underestimated the child she had disowned. She fell to her knees right there in the boardroom, preparing for her final, most desperate act. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom remained securely shut, sealing my family inside the exact trap they had arrogantly marched into. The silence that followed Dominic signing away the family business was absolute and suffocating. The reality of her complete financial ruin finally crashed down on Beatrice. She was no longer a wealthy matriarch. She was a criminal suspect with zero assets, staring down the barrel of a federal indictment. She remained on her knees on the polished marble floor. The woman who had spent her entire life obsessing over appearances, who had meticulously curated her image for the Manhattan elite, was now completely broken. Her designer dress was soaked with spilled water from the table. Her expensive makeup was ruined, running down her face in dark, messy streaks. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a manic, terrifying desperation. She did not look at Dominic, the son she had just betrayed. She did not look at Sydney, the golden child who was still sobbing hysterically in the corner. She looked only at me, the billionaire daughter she had spent 34 years treating like an absolute burden. Beatrice shuffled forward on her hands and knees. The sound of her silk dress dragging against the cold stone floor echoed loudly in the quiet room. She reached the spot right in front of where I stood at the head of the obsidian table. She reached up with trembling hands, trying to grab the fabric of my tailored blazer. "Jocelyn, please!" Beatrice wailed, her voice cracking into a high-pitched, pathetic shriek. "You have to stop this. You cannot let them take the business. You cannot let me go to prison. I am your mother. I gave you life." I looked down at her. I did not step away, and I did not reach out to comfort her. I simply stood there, an immovable mountain, looking at the woman who had caused me decades of profound emotional pain. "I gave you everything." Beatrice sobbed, tears pouring down her cheeks. "I raised you. I put a roof over your head. You owe me. You have billions of dollars, Jocelyn. I know you do. I saw the magazine. $2 million is absolutely nothing to you. Just pay the bank. Pay off the mortgage I took out and replace the business reserves. It is pocket change for you. Please just wire them the money right now so the authorities do not come after me." She buried her face in her hands, weeping loudly, expecting the heavy weight of maternal guilt to finally break my resolve. She fully expected me to cave, to revert to the obedient, desperate daughter who just wanted her mother's love and approval. But that daughter had died a long time ago. I looked down at Beatrice, feeling a sense of absolute, unshakable peace. There was no anger left in my heart. There was no resentment. There was only the cold, hard truth. "You are right, Beatrice," I said, my voice perfectly level, slicing through her hysterical crying. $2 million is pocket change for me. I could wire that money to the bank right this second. I could pay off your fraudulent mortgage. I could replace every single cent you stole from Dominic without even checking my account balances. It would not affect my bottom line in the slightest. Beatrice looked up, a sudden, desperate flicker of hope lighting up her ruined face. "Then do it," she begged, gasping for air. "Please, Jocelyn, just do it." I leaned forward slightly, maintaining dead, emotionless eye contact. But why would I ever spend a single dime on a woman who told me not to come to a family dinner because my cheap clothes would embarrass her? The flicker of hope in Beatrice's eyes instantly died, replaced by pure, freezing horror. I kept my voice dangerously quiet, making sure every word landed with maximum impact. "Less than 48 hours ago, you sent me a text message banning me from a restaurant because I did not fit your aesthetic. You told Charles Kensington I was a cautionary tale. You told everyone I was a failure scrubbing pots and pans. You have spent my entire life trying to make me feel small, worthless, and inadequate." I gestured toward Sydney, who was sitting on the floor across the room, staring at us in shock. "You stole your own son's future to buy a fake wedding for your favorite child," I continued. "You did not come to me for help because you love me. You came to me because you got caught. You do not want a daughter. You want an ATM to fund your shallow, pathetic delusions. You made your choices, Beatrice. Now you get to live with the consequences. I will not save you." Beatrice stared at me, her mouth opening and closing without sound. The brutal finality of my words finally broke through her profound narcissism. She realized in that exact second that I was completely untouchable. She could not manipulate me. She could not guilt me. I was cutting her out of my life permanently, and I was doing it with zero remorse. Beatrice let out a long, devastated wail and collapsed forward, burying her face against the cold marble floor. While my mother wept and my sister sobbed in the background, another movement caught my eye. Charles Kensington had been remarkably quiet for the last 10 minutes. The arrogant financial titan had watched his son get physically attacked, watched his fraudulent scheme get legally dismantled, and watched his wealthy Mark get financially executed. He realized that the Aura Holdings boardroom had turned into a slaughterhouse, and he was the next target. Charles slowly pushed his chair back from the table. He did not say a word to his bleeding son. He did not look at my weeping mother. He quietly turned and began walking briskly toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the boardroom. He was trying to sneak out, likely planning to rush back to his office to shred documents and begin moving his remaining assets before the federal authorities could freeze his domestic accounts. He almost made it to the exit. Kendra stepped away from Dominic's side. She moved with terrifying speed and precision. Her crimson suit flashed across the room as she positioned herself directly in front of the heavy wooden doors, physically blocking Charles Kensington's escape route. Charles stopped dead in his tracks. He looked at Kendra, his face pale and sweating. "Move out of my way," he demanded, his voice shaking as he tried to project a false sense of authority. "This meeting is over. I am leaving." Kendra did not flinch. She stood tall, radiating the absolute power of a chief legal officer who had just checkmated a massive financial criminal. She looked Charles up and down with an expression of pure, unadulterated triumph. She reached into her blazer pocket, pulling out her phone, and tapped the screen to check the time. "Going somewhere?" Charles Kendra asked, a brilliant, predatory smile spreading across her face. "I highly recommend you take a seat. The FBI is in the lobby." Charles Kensington froze, his hand hovering mere inches from the polished brass handle of the boardroom door. The color completely vanished from his face, leaving him looking like a hollow, terrified shell of the arrogant billionaire who had marched into my building just an hour ago. He stared at Kendra, his eyes darting wildly as if hoping her words were some kind of elaborate bluff. They were not. Before Charles could utter a single syllable, the heavy oak doors were pulled open from the outside, forcing Kendra to take a smooth step back. 4 men and 2 women in crisp, dark suits walked into the executive boardroom. The leader of the group, a tall man with a stern face and absolute authority, held up a gold badge that caught the light of the modern chandeliers. "Charles Kensington and Preston Kensington," the lead agent announced, his voice booming across the silent room. "We are with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We have warrants for your arrest on multiple charges, including wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and international money laundering." Charles stumbled backward, his expensive leather shoes slipping slightly on the marble floor. "This is a massive misunderstanding," Charles stammered, raising his hands in a pathetic gesture of surrender. "I am the CEO of Kensington Financial. I demand to speak to my legal counsel immediately. You cannot just storm into a private meeting like this." "You do not dictate the terms of your arrest," Charles Kendra interjected, stepping smoothly up to the federal agent. She handed the agent a secure digital drive. She did not raise her voice, but every word sliced through the room with lethal precision. "I submitted the uncut audio files of your full verbal confession to the federal prosecutor's office at 8 o'clock this morning. I also provided a comprehensive, fully sourced dossier detailing every single offshore account, proxy corporation, and illegal stock transfer you executed over the past 48 hours. The paper trail is flawless. You are entirely out of options." 2 federal agents moved swiftly past Charles and headed straight for the corner of the boardroom where Preston was still bleeding and cowering. Preston completely lost whatever dignity he had left. As the agents grabbed his arms and forcefully turned him around, he began to weep openly. It was not a quiet, dignified crying. It was the loud, gasping sobbing of a spoiled, entitled man-child who realized his entire world was collapsing. "Dad, do something!" Preston wailed as the cold metal handcuffs clicked loudly around his wrists. "Tell them I did not know. Tell them I am innocent. Please, I cannot go to jail. I cannot survive in prison." Charles did not answer his son. He was too busy being aggressively pinned against the glass wall of the boardroom by 2 other agents. He grunted in pain as his arms were pulled behind his back and the handcuffs ratcheted tight. His face was pressed against the cold glass, his perfectly styled hair ruined, his aura of untouchable wealth thoroughly shattered. Beatrice remained on the floor, watching the 2 men she had literally stolen millions of dollars to impress get treated like common street criminals. She was paralyzed by pure terror, realizing that she was the next target in the federal investigation. "Take them down to the transport vehicles," the lead agent ordered. The agents pulled Charles and Preston toward the doors. I stepped forward, falling into step right behind them. Kendra and Dominic flanked me. We were not going to miss the final act of this spectacular downfall. We followed the agents out of the boardroom and into the private executive elevator. The ride down to this ground floor took exactly 45 seconds. The silence in the elevator cab was absolute, save for the pathetic rhythmic sound of Preston sniffing and sobbing. Charles glared at me, his eyes filled with burning, venomous hatred, but he kept his mouth firmly shut. He knew that any threat he made now would just be added to the federal indictment. The elevator doors chimed and slid open, revealing the massive sweeping glass lobby of Aura Holdings. Charles stepped out of the elevator and instantly froze in his tracks. The lobby was not empty. Kendra had not just called the federal authorities that morning. She had made a series of anonymous, highly detailed phone calls to the most prominent financial journalists in Manhattan. She had tipped them off that the CEO of Kensington Financial was about to be arrested for a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme right in the lobby of my corporate headquarters. Over 30 reporters, photographers, and camera crews were clustered behind the velvet security ropes. The moment Charles and Preston stepped into the cavernous lobby in handcuffs, the space erupted into a blinding storm of camera flashes. The rapid clicking of camera shutters echoed like machine gun fire. Reporters shouted questions, their voices overlapping in a chaotic, deafening roar. Charles, is it true? Kensington Financial is completely insolvent. Preston, did you use stolen money to artificially inflate your stock prices? Charles, do you have any comment on the offshore laundering allegations? Charles bowed his head, trying desperately to hide his face from the relentless flashing lights. He squeezed his eyes shut, but there was nowhere to hide. The man who had spent his entire life obsessed with his elite social status, who had constantly looked down on anyone he deemed inferior, was now being publicly paraded as a pathetic, desperate thief. His pristine reputation was being permanently slaughtered in real-time broadcast to every major financial news network in the country. Preston was completely blinded by the camera flashes. He stumbled blindly forward, weeping openly as the agents shoved him through the revolving doors and out onto the busy Manhattan street. I stood on the elevated marble mezzanine with Kendra and Dominic, watching the federal vehicles load the disgraced Kensingtons into the back seats. The heavy doors slammed shut, and the black SUVs merged into the city traffic, carrying away the last remnants of their fraudulent dynasty. We turned around and rode the elevator back up to the 70th floor. When we walked back into the boardroom, the energy had shifted from chaotic panic to an eerie, hollow silence. Beatrice was still sitting on the floor, staring blankly at the wall, fully disassociated from reality. But Sydney was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows. She was looking out at the city skyline, trembling violently. The absolute devastation of her reality had finally settled over her. She was not marrying into a billionaire dynasty. She was not going to Paris. She had no rich husband to elevate her status. Sydney slowly raised her left hand. She stared at the massive glittering ring on her finger, the ring she had shoved in my face for months. The ring Preston had admitted was just cheap cubic zirconia bought for $200 to maintain his illusion of wealth. Sydney grabbed the ring with her right hand and violently yanked it off her finger. She threw it across the room. The cheap metal hit the polished marble floor with a sharp, hollow ping that echoed through the quiet boardroom. Her legs gave out beneath her. Sydney collapsed onto her knees, clutching her stomach as a raw, agonizing sob tore from her throat. She had spent her entire life laughing while my mother tore me down, believing her golden child status made her invincible. Now she was kneeling on the floor of my corporate headquarters. She had no rich husband, no money, and absolutely no future. 3 days had passed since the federal authorities cleared out my boardroom. The fallout across Manhattan was swift, brutal, and entirely public. Charles and Preston Kensington were denied bail deemed flight risks due to their offshore accounts. But while they sat in federal holding cells, the financial shockwave hit my mother with devastating speed. Because Beatrice had committed bank fraud to secure the $2 million second mortgage, the bank did not wait around. The moment the federal indictment was unsealed, the bank immediately triggered a default clause. They foreclosed on her sprawling suburban estate. Beatrice was officially facing total insurmountable bankruptcy. I decided to take a personal drive out to the suburbs on Thursday morning. The crisp autumn air felt incredibly refreshing as my driver pulled my town car up to the edge of my mother's driveway. I stepped out and walked up the cobblestone path. Through the large bay windows, I could see the absolute chaos unfolding inside the pristine house that Beatrice had worshipped above all else. Cardboard moving boxes were stacked haphazardly in the grand foyer. Expensive vases were wrapped in old newspapers. The manicured illusion of her high society life was being shoved into garbage bags. I did not knock. The front door was slightly ajar, propped open by a heavy bronze doorstop to allow the movers to pass through. I pushed the door open and stepped into the foyer. My heels clicked sharply against the hardwood floor. Beatrice whipped around, dropping a stack of expensive porcelain plates back into a cardboard box. She looked entirely haggard. Her perfectly styled hair was flat and unwashed, and she wore a plain oversized sweater that looked like it had been pulled from the bottom of a laundry hamper. The moment she saw me standing in her foyer, the sheer panic on her face completely vanished. It was instantly replaced by a massive blinding wave of profound delusion. She let out a loud, breathless gasp of pure relief. Jocelyn Beatrice cried out, practically tripping over a box as she rushed toward me. Her eyes filled with desperate, hopeful tears. I knew you would come. I told Sydney you would not just abandon us. I knew you would not let your own mother be homeless. She reached out to grab my hands fully, expecting me to pull a checkbook from my tailored blazer and make the foreclosure vanish. She genuinely believed that the crushing reality of losing her precious house had finally broken my resolve. She thought I was there to save her at the very last minute. I did not move. I kept my hands firmly by my sides, letting her desperate, grasping fingers meet nothing but empty air. I looked around the chaotic foyer, taking in the stacked boxes and the bare walls where her expensive art used to hang. Then I reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out a small rectangular piece of cardstock. I held it out to her. Beatrice looked down, expecting to see a blank check or a bank draft. Instead, she saw a business card. She took it from my hand, her brow furrowing in deep confusion. She read the text on the card out loud. The Starlight Motor Inn. It is a roadside motel out by the interstate. Jocelyn, what is this? Why are you giving me this? I am giving it to you because they offer a weekly discount rate. I replied, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any warmth. And since your bank accounts are currently frozen by the federal government, I highly suggest you call them before they book up for the weekend. Beatrice stared at me, the desperate hope completely dying in her eyes. But you are here, she stammered, her voice shaking. You came all this way. I thought you came to pay the bank. I offered her a cold, empty smile. I am not here to pay the bank, Beatrice. I am here to conduct a physical inventory. I stepped past her, walking purposefully into the main living room. I ran my hand along the polished surface of a massive 18th-century mahogany dining table. I gestured to a set of antique velvet armchairs and a towering grandfather clock in the corner. When Dominic signed over his 30% shareholder stake in the family business to Aura Holdings, we gained control of all the corporate assets, I explained smoothly. As it turns out, my father purchased most of the expensive antique furniture in this house, using the corporate business accounts for tax write-off purposes. That means these antiques do not belong to you. They legally belong to the brokerage, which means they now legally belong to me. Beatrice gasped, clutching a hand to her chest. You are taking my furniture, you are throwing me out on the street, and you are taking my dining table. I turned to face her, projecting absolute, unyielding authority. I am simply securing my corporate property. I came here personally to make absolutely sure you do not try to pack any of these antiques into a moving truck to sell at a pawn shop. My logistics team will be arriving in 20 minutes with a moving van to collect my items. Do not touch anything that does not belong to you. A loud, heavy thud echoed from the top of the grand staircase. I looked up. Sydney was standing on the landing. She looked like a ghost. She was clutching a black plastic garbage bag, overflowing with designer clothes. Her face was pale, her eyes red and swollen from crying over her destroyed wedding and her fraudulent fiancé. Sydney glared down at me, her face twisting with pure, unadulterated hatred. She gripped the railing tightly, her knuckles turning white. You are a monster! Sydney screamed, her voice cracking as it echoed through the empty vaulted ceiling of the house. You have billions of dollars and you are coming here to take our furniture. You are a cold, heartless monster. I looked up at the golden child. I looked at the sister who had spent her entire life mocking me, using my mother's stolen money to fund her shallow, pathetic existence. I did not feel an ounce of pity for her tears. I felt the profound, absolute satisfaction of a long-awaited victory. I smiled up at her. It was a bright, terrifyingly calm smile. No, Sydney, I am just a businesswoman, I said, my voice ringing out clearly through the empty foyer. And the head count in this house is currently 0. Get out. I walked down the cobblestone path without breaking my stride. I did not turn back to look at the sprawling suburban house that had been the site of so much manufactured misery. My driver stood waiting by the open door of my town car. I slid into the leather seat, smoothed my tailored blazer, and instructed him to take me back to Manhattan. As the car pulled away from the curb, I opened my tablet and went straight back to work. I had a multi-billion-dollar empire to run, and the true fallout of my family's disastrous choices was just beginning to hit the public sphere. By Friday morning, the Kensington scandal had completely taken over the city. Every major financial news network was running the story on a continuous, relentless loop. The morning shows, the business channels, and the elite social blogs were entirely consumed by the dramatic implosion of a supposedly untouchable Wall Street dynasty. The headlines were ruthless, spectacular, and utterly vindicating. Wall Street Titan brought down by secret audio. Federal indictment rocks Kensington Financial, the fake ring, and the offshore accounts. But the headline that dominated the front page of the leading Financial Times was my absolute personal favorite. The 34-year-old female CEO who dismantled an old money fraud ring. The media was absolutely obsessed with the narrative. For years, I had deliberately kept my name out of the press, choosing to operate in the shadows, while my properties gained legendary status. Now, the notoriously private self-made billionaire had stepped into the light by single-handedly exposing a massive Ponzi scheme that had been hiding in plain sight. News anchors marveled at the sheer surgical precision of the takedown. Financial analysts praised the flawless execution of the legal traps Kendra had meticulously set. They displayed Charles Kensington's federal mugshot right next to my sleek professional corporate portrait. The irony was not lost on me. Less than a week ago, my mother had sat in my restaurant and told the Kensingtons that I was a destitute embarrassment scrubbing pots and pans. Now the entire financial sector was studying my corporate maneuvers like a masterclass in aggressive business strategy. While my professional profile skyrocketed into the stratosphere, Beatrice was experiencing the exact opposite trajectory. The high society elite she had worshipped her entire life turned on her with vicious, breathtaking speed. The women she had spent decades trying to impress, the socialites she had bought expensive gifts for using stolen money, suddenly suffered from collective amnesia regarding her existence. Her phone, which usually buzzed constantly with luncheon invitations and charity gala updates, went completely dead. I received a detailed report from my security team, who were still monitoring the liquidation of her assets. Beatrice had checked into the Starlight Motor Inn just as I suggested. She was sitting in a cheap, cramped motel room with flickering neon lights buzzing outside her window, frantically trying to call her wealthy friends for a temporary loan or a favor. Every single call went straight to voicemail. The people she had considered her peers treated her bank fraud indictment like a highly contagious disease. The ultimate humiliation arrived by certified mail to the front desk of that roadside motel. The prestigious country club she had spent thousands of dollars to join officially revoked her membership. The board of directors sent a brief, brutally formal letter citing a strict morality clause. They explicitly refused to associate their pristine brand with a woman implicated in a federal embezzlement investigation. Beatrice was a complete social pariah. She had sold her soul, destroyed her son's future, and alienated her daughter just for a seat at the elite table. And the exact moment she lost her wealth, those same elites wiped her name from the guest list without a single second thought. She had sacrificed everything for a social circle that viewed her as entirely disposable. Meanwhile, back in Manhattan, Charles Kensington's ultimate threat proved to be completely hollow. I had warned me on the phone that exposing him would trigger a media scandal that would ruin my reputation in the hospitality industry. He had promised that the elite patrons of the Obsidian Room would flee if they knew the founder had thrown her own mother out of her home. He could not have been more wrong. The mystery surrounding my identity, combined with the ruthless dismantling of a corrupt financial firm, turned into the greatest public relations triumph in the history of Aura Holdings. Wealthy clients do not respect weakness, they respect absolute power. And I had just demonstrated that I possessed enough power to crush a Wall Street firm before lunch. Instead of fleeing, the Manhattan elite flocked to my properties. Our membership waiting list doubled in 48 hours. People were desperate to dine at the exact table where the Kensingtons had been publicly handed a $32,000 bill and escorted out by security. The Obsidian Room became an absolute legend overnight. It was no longer just an exclusive restaurant. It was a monument to absolute authority. High net worth investors were practically begging to funnel their capital into my real estate portfolios. They knew that a CEO who could clinically execute a federal trap against her own blackmailers would protect their investments with the same ruthless efficiency. My business boomed to unprecedented heights. Kendra was flooded with lucrative offers from rival corporate law firms trying to poach her, but she turned every single one down with a satisfied smile, choosing to remain my global partner. Dominic, free from the crushing weight of my mother's demands, stepped into his new role at my company with a brilliant, renewed sense of purpose. I sat in my penthouse on Saturday evening, looking out over the city that was currently buzzing with my name. I had proven that I was not just a capable hospitality manager. I was an apex predator in the financial world. I had won the war, secured my empire, and completely neutralized the people who had tried to destroy me. But the dust had not fully settled. Because as I enjoyed the quiet peace of my secure fortress, the golden child of the family was about to realize that she had run completely out of options. 2 weeks had passed since the federal authorities dismantled the Kensington fraud ring, and my mother was removed from her foreclosed suburban estate. The media frenzy had slowly begun to transition from breaking news to in-depth financial analysis, but the peace in my personal life was already absolute. I decided it was time to celebrate the people who actually mattered. I closed the Obsidian Room to the public for the entire evening. It was a massive loss of nightly revenue, but I did not care. The most exclusive dining club in Manhattan was completely empty, save for one table in the center of the main dining room. The only people sitting at that table were Dominic, Kendra, and myself. The atmosphere was a total departure from the rigid, miserable family dinners my mother used to orchestrate. There was no forced, polite conversation. There were no cutting remarks about weight or status, or who was wearing the right designer labels. The lighting was warm, and the music was a soft, rhythmic jazz that perfectly matched the relaxed energy in the room. Kendra looked absolutely radiant. She wore a stunning emerald green evening gown, her beautiful locks styled in an elegant cascade over her shoulder. She was laughing freely, sipping a glass of rare champagne, completely unburdened by the toxic microaggressions she used to endure from my mother. As an African-American woman who had fought tooth and nail to climb the ranks of corporate law, she had always maintained a flawless armor. Tonight, she was simply family. Dominic sat beside her, looking genuinely rested for the first time in his adult life. The heavy dark circles under his eyes had faded. The crushing weight of carrying our mother's financial delusions had been entirely lifted from his shoulders. He looked like a man who had finally been given permission to breathe. We finished our main course of butter-poached lobster and wild mushroom risotto. As the waitstaff discreetly cleared our plates, I signaled for my general manager to bring over the items I had kept secured in his office safe. He approached with a silver tray bearing two thick embossed leather portfolios. I placed one in front of Dominic and the other in front of Kendra. Dominic looked at the portfolio and then up at me, his brow furrowing in mild confusion. "What is this, Jocelyn? We already finalized the absorption of the brokerage assets last week." "Open it," I said, leaning back in my chair. Dominic unclasped the leather cover and read the first page. His eyes scanned the heavy cardstock and his jaw slowly dropped. He read the title of the document out loud, his voice barely a whisper. Vice President of Operations for Aura Holdings Commercial Real Estate Division. I let the reality of the title sink in before I spoke. Beatrice stole your business, Dominic. She liquidated 15 years of your blood, sweat, and tears to buy Sydney a fake prince. I absorbed those assets to protect them from the federal government. But I have no intention of managing a brokerage. I am establishing a brand new commercial real estate branch under the Aura Holdings umbrella, and I need someone with your exact expertise to run it. You will have full operational control, a massive acquisition budget, and a salary that reflects your actual worth. Dominic stared at the contract. For his entire life, his hard work had been taken for granted. He had been the dutiful workhorse expected to sacrifice his own happiness to keep the family afloat, while Sydney received all the glory. Now he was being handed the keys to a division that would dwarf his old company within a year. Jocelyn, this is massive, Dominic said, his voice thick with emotion. Are you sure about this? I have never been more sure of anything, I replied firmly. You are a brilliant businessman, Dominic. Our mother was just too blinded by her own greed to see it. You belong at the top. Dominic did not hesitate. He picked up his pen and signed the contract, securing a future that no one could ever steal from him again. I then turned my attention to Kendra. She was looking at her own leather portfolio, a knowing smile playing on her lips. Let me guess, Kendra teased smoothly. You are giving me a raise for personally handing the FBI the wire fraud evidence that tanked a Wall Street firm. Not quite, I said, matching her smile. Go ahead and open it. Kendra opened her portfolio. Her eyes darted across the page. The confident, brilliant attorney who never let anything rattle her suddenly went completely still. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with genuine shock. Jocelyn, you cannot be serious, Kendra breathed. I am deadly serious, I answered. The contract in front of her was not a raise. It was an elevation of status that transcended any salary. For years, Beatrice and Sydney had treated Kendra like a second-class citizen. They had sneered at her heritage and dismissed her profound legal intellect, viewing her as someone who did not belong in their manufactured elite circle. You are no longer the chief legal officer of Aura Holdings, I stated clearly. As of tomorrow morning, you are officially promoted to global partner. You will hold equity in every single property club and real estate venture we acquire moving forward. You are not just my lawyer, Kendra. You are family, and you are the backbone of this empire. Kendra closed the folder. She reached across the table and grasped my hand tightly. The unspoken bond between us solidified in that exact moment. We were two women who had been constantly underestimated and disrespected by the exact same toxic people, and we had just built an untouchable fortress together. Dominic raised his glass of champagne. To true family, he toasted, his voice ringing out in the empty restaurant. The family you choose. To true family, Kendra and I echoed, clinking our glasses together. It was the perfect moment. A celebration of genuine loyalty, mutual respect, and absolute victory. But my old family had a habit of refusing to stay buried in the past. Just as the dessert course was being prepared, the heavy mahogany doors of the main dining room swung open. My general manager walked briskly toward our table. He maintained his impeccable professional posture, but there was a distinct tension in his rapid footsteps. He stopped at my side and bowed his head slightly, holding out a sleek black smartphone. I am so sorry to interrupt your private celebration, ma'am, he said, his voice kept low. But my security team at the front entrance just radioed up. I put my champagne glass down. What is the problem, Mr. Thorne? He looked deeply uncomfortable. There is a woman standing outside in the pouring rain, ma'am. She is highly agitated and making quite a scene on the sidewalk. She is aggressively demanding to be let inside the building. I narrowed my eyes. Did she give a name? Yes, ma'am, Mr. Thorne replied, handing me the phone, which displayed the live feed from the front door's security camera. She claims she is your sister. I placed my linen napkin on the table and looked at my general manager. I did not feel a spike of panic or a rush of anger. I felt the absolute unshakable calm of a woman who was in total control of her territory. Keep my brother and my sister-in-law's glasses full, Mr. Thorne, I instructed smoothly. I will handle this situation myself. Kendra gave me a firm, supportive nod. Dominic did not even turn his head toward the entrance. He simply took another sip of his champagne, entirely unbothered by the fact that the sister who had happily fed off his stolen inheritance was currently standing in the pouring rain. I stood up and walked out of the main dining room. I moved through the grand vaulted corridors of the obsidian room. The ambient lighting cast a warm golden glow against the dark polished stone walls. Everything about the space radiated quiet, untouchable wealth. It was a stark, brutal contrast to the scene waiting for me just beyond the heavy glass doors of the lobby. I approached the front entrance where two of my towering security guards stood on high alert. Through the thick, rain-streaked glass, I could see her. Sydney was standing under the glow of a street lamp on the wet Manhattan pavement. The torrential autumn rain was coming down in relentless sheets. She had no umbrella. She was wearing a trench coat that looked completely soaked through, and she was clutching a cheap generic tote bag against her chest. This was the same woman who just weeks ago had scoffed at my sensible clothes. This was the golden child who had proudly flashed a massive fake diamond ring in my face and bragged about her upcoming honeymoon in the Swiss Alps. Now her expensive hair extensions were matted to her skull. Her designer makeup was running down her face in dark, ugly rivers. She looked entirely broken, pathetic, and utterly unrecognizable. I signaled for the guards to open the door, just enough for me to step out under the heavy brass-trimmed awning. The cold wind immediately whipped around me, but I stayed perfectly dry beneath the shelter of my building. Sydney saw me step outside and let out a loud, desperate sob. She stumbled forward, stopping right at the edge of the velvet security ropes. Jocelyn Sydney cried out, her voice competing with the sound of the pouring rain and the distant city traffic. "Please, you have to let me inside. I am freezing. I have nowhere else to go." I stood with my hands in the pockets of my tailored trousers. I did not invite her under the awning. I did not offer her a towel. "The head count is final, Sydney," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the noise of the storm. "What do you want?" Sydney shivered violently, wrapping her arms around her own waist. "I lost everything," she sobbed, her chest heaving. "The federal investigators interrogated me for 3 days. They froze all of my bank accounts. Preston put all the luxury vendor contracts for the wedding reception in my name before he was arrested. I owe hundreds of thousands of dollars to caterers and event planners, and I have absolutely no way to pay them. The credit card companies are calling me every 10 minutes. I am completely bankrupt." She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a manic, terrifying desperation. "Mom is living in a disgusting motel by the highway," Sydney continued, her voice cracking. "She cannot help me. She does not even have enough money to buy groceries, let alone pay my legal fees. I am drowning, Jocelyn. Please, I am your sister." I stared at her, feeling a profound sense of detachment. She was not crying because she felt remorse for her actions. She was crying because the consequences of her own blinding arrogance had finally caught up to her. "I need a job," Sydney begged, stepping closer to the rope. "Please, Jocelyn, you own this entire empire. You have clubs, hotels, and real estate offices. I will do anything. I can be a hostess at the restaurant. I can greet the guests. I know how to talk to high society people. I can be useful to you. Just give me a paycheck so I can get a lawyer and an apartment." I looked at the weeping, shivering woman standing in the rain. I thought about the decades of subtle cruelty she had inflicted upon me. I thought about the time Beatrice drained my college savings account so Sydney could backpack across Europe, and how Sydney had eagerly packed her designer bags without uttering a single word of protest. I thought about how she had sat in my restaurant and laughed while our mother called me a worthless failure. "You do not know how to talk to high society people, Sydney," I corrected her, my tone dropping to a lethal chill. "The people you thought were your peers completely abandoned you the second the FBI arrested your fake fiancé. Your social value is less than zero." Sydney let out a pathetic wail, but I did not stop. "And you do not want a job." I continued, stripping away the last of her delusions. "You have never worked a single hard day in your entire 28 years on this earth. You do not want to earn a paycheck. You just want a savior. You want someone to magically wave a magic wand, clear your massive debts, and hand you a comfortable life so you do not have to face the terrifying reality of the real world." "Jocelyn, please," Sydney gasped, falling to her knees right there on the wet pavement. "Do not do this to me. You spent 28 years laughing while our mother tore me down piece by piece," I said, looking down at her kneeling form. "You eagerly fed off the resources they stole from Dominic. You were perfectly happy to watch me struggle as long as you remained the golden child. I am not your savior, Sydney. I am the woman you threw away." Sydney covered her face with her wet, trembling hands, sobbing uncontrollably onto the sidewalk. I took a step backward, retreating toward the heavy glass doors of my lobby. I looked at Mr. Thorne and the 2 massive security guards standing at the entrance. "If she tries to step foot on this property again, call the police immediately," I ordered, projecting my voice so Sydney would hear every single word. "Have her arrested for trespassing." "Yes, ma'am," the guards responded in unison. "Jocelyn, wait!" Sydney screamed from the pavement, reaching a desperate hand out toward the closing doors. I did not wait. I did not look back. I turned my back on my sister forever, walking smoothly back into the warm, golden light of my empire. I left the golden child crying in the gutter, completely consumed by the storm she had helped create. 2 months drifted by in a state of absolute uninterrupted peace. The bitter autumn rain that had washed my sister away from my front doors had long since frozen into a crisp Manhattan winter. Inside my penthouse, the climate was perfectly controlled. I sat on my velvet sofa with a cup of hot black tea resting in my hands. The city below was decorated for the holidays, a time of year that used to fill me with suffocating dread. For 3 decades, the holidays meant bracing myself for my mother's brutal critiques and my sister's relentless bragging. Now the season belonged entirely to me. I placed my teacup on the marble coaster and picked up my tablet to review the catering menus for my upcoming charity event. As I swiped through the options, my personal cell phone buzzed against the table. I glanced down. The screen displayed a voicemail notification from an unsaved number. I knew exactly who it was. Toxic people always find a way to crawl out of the woodwork when the holidays approach, hoping that societal guilt will magically erase their unforgivable actions. I did not feel a spike of anxiety. I felt nothing but mild clinical curiosity. I tapped the screen and put the audio on speakerphone, letting the sound fill the quiet space of my living room. The audio crackled with harsh static. In the background, I could hear the distinct, obnoxious blare of a cheap television and the heavy rumble of highway traffic. It was the unmistakable soundtrack of rock bottom. Then my mother's voice came through the speaker. It was shaky, frail, and completely stripped of the arrogant, aristocratic tone she had spent her entire life perfecting. "Jocelyn, it is your mother," Beatrice whispered. Her voice carried a pathetic manufactured tremble. "I know you told the security at your building to turn me away, but I had to borrow a prepaid phone just to hear your voice. The bank took absolutely everything. I am living in a miserable 300-square-foot studio apartment out in the industrial district. The heat barely works. Do you have any idea what I am doing to survive, Jocelyn? I am working the cash register at a discount department store. I spend 9 hours a day standing on my feet folding cheap sweaters for minimum wage. My manager is half my age and she yells at me when I do not scan the coupons fast enough. My hands are cracked from the cheap soap in the employee restroom. I tried calling my friends from the country club to ask for a small loan, and every single one of them blocked my number. I am completely alone." I listened to her complaints without an ounce of pity. She was describing the reality of everyday life for millions of hardworking people. But to Beatrice, doing honest labor was a fate worse than death. She paused, expecting the sheer horror of her retail job to suddenly break my heart. When the silence stretched on, she pivoted straight back to her classic manipulation tactics. "You did this to me," Beatrice sobbed, her voice turning bitter and venomous. "You had all the power and you chose to throw your own mother into poverty. Sydney will not even speak to me because she blames me for Preston going to federal prison. Dominic blocked my number and refused to pay my rent. You completely destroyed this family, Jocelyn. We are broken because of your greed and your absolute cruelty. I hope your billions keep you warm at night. I hope you sit in your massive empty tower and realize that no amount of money will ever buy you a real—" I did not let her finish the sentence. I reached forward and tapped the red button on my screen, cutting off her pathetic guilt trip mid-breath. The silence rushed back into the penthouse, crisp and incredibly clean. I did not feel the need to call her back to defend myself or to explain that her own bank fraud had destroyed her life. Explaining reality to a narcissist is a profound waste of time. I did not feel anger toward her delusion. I simply felt entirely unburdened. By pressing that delete button, I was severing the final invisible thread that tied me to a lifetime of emotional abuse. Beatrice had spent 34 years demanding that I shrink myself to fit into her shallow, superficial worldview. She had demanded that I tolerate her insults, apologize for my existence, and sacrifice my happiness to make her comfortable. Now she was sitting in a freezing apartment screaming into a void because the scapegoat she had relied on had built an impenetrable fortress. She was finally facing the consequences of treating her children like disposable assets. Dominic was thriving, running my commercial real estate division with absolute brilliance. Sydney was drowning in the debts she had accumulated to impress a convicted felon. And Beatrice was folding clothes for a manager who did not care about her ruined pedigree. The universe had perfectly balanced the scales. I tapped the screen 2 more times. I deleted the voicemail, permanently erasing it from my device and from my life. Then I selected the unsaved number and blocked it. I felt a profound, undeniable sense of closure. The ultimate power over a toxic parent is not screaming or seeking revenge. It is absolute, complete indifference. She was no longer a monster who haunted my thoughts. She was just a stranger working at a department store, and her problems were entirely her own. I set the phone down and turned my attention back to the tablet. The past was officially buried, and the future required my immediate attention. Tonight was the most important night of my professional career. The private elevator chimed softly. The steel doors slid open, and Kendra stepped into my foyer. She looked absolutely breathtaking in a tailored silver evening gown. Her locks were styled flawlessly, catching the ambient light of the penthouse. As the newly minted global partner of Aura Holdings, she carried herself with a relaxed, unshakable confidence that commanded every room she entered. "The logistics team just called from the ballroom," Kendra announced, walking into the living room with a bright, triumphant smile. "The floral arrangements are fully installed, and the press pool is setting up behind the velvet ropes. The mayor just confirmed his attendance, and the silent auction has already raised $2 million before the doors have even opened. Are you ready for tonight, Jocelyn?" I stood up and smoothed the fabric of my cashmere sweater. Tonight was not just another corporate victory. I was hosting the inaugural gala for the Aura Foundation, my newly established charity dedicated to providing legal and financial resources for women escaping domestic and financial abuse. I was using the very empire my family claimed was worthless to fund the freedom of thousands of women. I looked at Kendra and smiled, a genuine, radiant smile. "I just need to put on my dress," I replied, my voice steady and full of anticipation. "Tell the security team to lock down the perimeter. We have a gala to launch." I stepped out of my private elevator and walked directly into the grand ballroom of the Obsidian Room. The space had been completely transformed for the evening. The usual moody, intimate dining setup had been replaced by a brilliant, sweeping venue of crystalline light. Waitstaff in pristine uniforms moved seamlessly through the crowd, carrying silver trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. The room was packed with the actual power players of New York. There were genuine philanthropists, tech innovators, and real estate moguls who dealt in actual liquid capital. These were people who had earned their status through hard work and brilliance, not the desperate smoke and mirrors illusion of wealth that my mother had spent her entire life chasing. Tonight was the official launch of the Aura Foundation. I had personally seeded the initiative with a $10 million endowment from my own private accounts. The mission of the foundation was highly specific and deeply personal. We were providing immediate, unrestricted financial grants and elite legal representation to women who had been financially abused by their spouses or controlled and extorted by their own toxic families. I knew exactly what it felt like to have someone try to use money as a weapon to force submission. I knew what it felt like to have a parent use financial leverage to strip away a person's autonomy and self-worth. I had watched my mother do it to my brother for decades, and I had watched her try to do it to me. I was making absolutely sure that thousands of women would never have to bow to that kind of suffocating pressure. A soft chime rang through the ballroom, signaling the beginning of the evening's formal presentation. The low hum of conversation faded into a respectful silence as the guests took their seats at the elegantly decorated tables. I walked up the short flight of stairs to the raised stage and stepped behind the clear acrylic podium. I wore a sleek, tailored black evening gown with sharp architectural lines that projected absolute authority. I looked out over the sea of faces, taking a slow, steady breath. The bright stage lights felt warm, but my mind was perfectly clear and incredibly calm. "Good evening," I said, my voice echoing clearly through the state-of-the-art sound system. "Thank you all for being here tonight to support the launch of the Aura Foundation." I looked down at the front row. Kendra was sitting there looking radiant in her emerald gown, her eyes locked on me with fierce, unwavering support. Beside her sat Dominic, sitting tall and proud, completely transformed from the exhausted, beaten-down man he had been just a month ago. For a very long time, I was told that I was a massive failure. I continued letting my words ring out across the silent ballroom. I was told by people who were supposed to love me that my worth was defined entirely by who I married, what social circle I appeased, and how quietly I accepted constant, blatant disrespect. I was told that choosing my own path made me a profound disappointment. I gripped the edges of the podium, leaning forward slightly. Financial abuse does not always look like a stolen credit card or an empty bank account, I stated, ensuring every single person in the room felt the weight of the truth. Sometimes it looks like a family member using a future inheritance as a leash to control your daily choices. Sometimes it looks like being told you are entirely useless because you refuse to let someone else dictate your destiny. It is the insidious, quiet manipulation that teaches women to shrink themselves just to keep the peace in a toxic household. The crowd was completely captivated. There was no whispering. There was no clinking of glassware. They were hanging on my every word. When you are constantly told that you are nothing, you are faced with two distinct choices, I said, my voice rising with unshakable conviction. You can believe their lies and surrender your autonomy, or you can choose to walk away and build a kingdom where their toxic opinions hold absolutely zero currency. I chose to build the kingdom. I chose to lay my own bricks, secure my own capital, and completely lock the doors against anyone who demanded my submission. I looked back down at Kendra and Dominic, offering them a bright, genuine smile. But not everyone has the immediate resources to walk away from financial captivity, I told the crowd. That is exactly why the Aura Foundation exists. Starting tonight, we are handing women the hammers they need to shatter those cages. We are providing the capital, the legal firepower, and the unyielding support required to help them build their own empires. We are going to ensure that no woman ever has to tolerate abuse simply because she cannot afford the price of her own freedom. I stepped back from the microphone. For a brief suspended second, the ballroom was entirely silent. Then the eruption began. It started with a few prominent investors in the front, and within seconds it swelled into a deafening, roaring wave of applause. The entire room stood up. Hundreds of New York's most powerful executives, attorneys, and philanthropists were giving me a massive standing ovation. The sound was incredible, washing over the stage in a relentless tide of absolute validation. I looked down at the center table. Kendra was on her feet, clapping fiercely, her face glowing with immense pride and profound solidarity. Dominic was right beside her, cheering loudly for the sister he finally understood and respected. He was not just clapping for a CEO, he was clapping for the woman who had saved his life by destroying the people who tried to ruin it. I stood on the stage and let the applause wash over me. I thought back to the frantic, miserable engagement dinner that had taken place in this exact building just weeks ago. I thought about the desperate, pathetic attempts my mother and sister had made to humiliate me. They had wanted to make me feel small. Instead, they had handed me the exact motivation I needed to publicly cement my legacy. This was my triumph. It was loud, it was public, and it was entirely earned. I walked down the steps of the stage to join my real family, ready to celebrate a victory that no one could ever take away. The rest of the evening blurred into a magnificent symphony of clinking crystal and genuine laughter. I spent hours shaking hands with investors who wrote massive checks for the Aura Foundation, right there on the ballroom floor. These were not the superficial social climbers my mother used to court. These were titans of industry who understood the exact value of resilience and power. They recognized that the same ruthless efficiency I used to dismantle a corrupt financial firm was now being directed toward protecting vulnerable women. The donations poured in, completely securing the future of the foundation for the next decade. Kendra stood by my side the entire night, fielding questions from prominent law firms who were desperate to understand the legal maneuvering she used to take down the Kensington family. She handled them all with a sharp, brilliant smile, making it perfectly clear that she was absolutely not on the market for a new job. She was building an empire right where she was. Dominic mingled effortlessly with real estate developers, already laying the groundwork for the massive commercial expansion I had trusted him to lead. Watching my brother and my sister-in-law thrive in an environment that actually respected their intellect was worth every single struggle I had endured. As the midnight hour approached, the crowd slowly began to thin out. The waitstaff moved quietly through the room, clearing the final dessert plates and pouring the last rounds of vintage champagne. I excused myself from a conversation with a prominent tech investor and made my way toward the heavy glass doors at the far end of the ballroom. I pushed them open and stepped out onto the expansive private balcony of the obsidian room. The crisp, biting air of the New York winter hit my face, but I did not feel the cold. I walked over to the edge of the stone railing and looked out over the glittering Manhattan skyline. The city stretched out before me, an endless ocean of golden lights and towering steel. The streets far below were still humming with late-night traffic, but up here on the 70th floor, the world was incredibly peaceful. I took a slow, deep breath of the freezing air, letting the profound silence of the high altitude wash over me. Down below, millions of people were living their lives completely unaware of the brutal financial war that had just been waged and won inside this very skyscraper. I thought about the people who had tried to destroy me. I pictured Charles and Preston sitting in a federal holding facility, entirely stripped of the wealth and arrogance that had shielded them their entire lives. They were trading their tailored suits for prison uniforms, facing decades behind bars for the fraud they committed to maintain their pathetic illusions. I thought about Sydney drowning in the crushing debt she accumulated to impress a man who never loved her, weeping over a cheap cubic zirconia ring that represented her entire worthless reality. And I thought about Beatrice standing on her feet for 9 hours a day, in a discount store trapped in the exact life she considered a fate worse than death. She had traded her son's future and her daughter's love for a seat at a table that did not even exist. For 34 years, I believed that their rejection was a reflection of my worth. I had internalized every cruel comment, every subtle insult, and every blatant exclusion. I thought my inability to fit into their shallow, toxic mold meant that I was somehow defective. I spent my youth trying to prove that I was smart enough, capable enough, and worthy enough to earn my mother's affection. Standing on this balcony, I finally understood the absolute truth. I was never defective. I was just entirely too large for the tiny, pathetic cages they tried to force me into. Their cruelty was not a measure of my failure. It was a desperate, terrified reaction to my potential. They tried to break me because they subconsciously knew that if I ever realized my own true strength, I would become completely unstoppable. They needed me to be weak so they could feel powerful. The heavy glass door opened softly behind me. I heard the familiar, confident click of Kendra's heels followed by Dominic's steady footsteps. They did not say a word. They simply walked over and stood on either side of me, resting their hands on the stone railing, looking out at the exact same breathtaking view. Kendra handed me a fresh flute of champagne. The crystal felt cool and solid in my hand. We stood there together, the three outcasts who had been told we were not good enough, entirely united in our victory. We did not need to speak about Beatrice or Sydney or the Kensingtons. Those names belonged to the past. They were ghosts buried under the foundation of the very building we were standing in. The future belonged exclusively to us. I looked down at the street level far below where the velvet ropes of my club kept the city at bay. I thought about the text message that had started this entire chain of events. They told me I did not fit the headcount. They were right. I was never meant to be a guest at their table. I was meant to own the building. I raised my glass, taking a slow, deliberate step forward, and brought the rim to my lips. I took a sip of the expensive champagne. The liquid burned pleasantly down my throat, a perfect reflection of the fire I had used to burn my past to the ground. I felt the profound total peace of a woman who had meticulously cut out the poison and built a kingdom from the ashes. There was no lingering sadness. There were no lingering regrets. I had absolutely nothing left to prove to anyone. I looked up at the endless dark sky, feeling the heavy, magnificent weight of total absolute freedom. It was not just vindication, it was sweet, unadulterated victory. The most profound lesson woven throughout this journey is that true power is born the moment you stop seeking validation from those committed to misunderstanding you. For years, the protagonist internalized her family's cruel narrative, believing she was a failure simply because she refused to conform to their shallow, status-obsessed expectations. Her mother and sister used their conditional approval as a weapon to keep her feeling small and inadequate. However, the turning point did not come from an explosive argument. It came from the quiet, radical decision to walk away and build her own kingdom from the ground up. By cutting ties with the people who constantly diminished her worth, she created the necessary space to realize her actual potential. This story teaches us that our value is not determined by the head count at a toxic family table. When we stop accepting the cramped cages others build for us, we unlock the strength to construct our own empires. True freedom lies in absolute indifference to the people who once tried to break us. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic environment to build your own success? And if so, how did it change your life? Share your story and comment below.